Every quiet night has a way of bringing back what the day helped you avoid. When the room goes still, when the phone is down, when no one needs anything from you, there it is again. What they said, what they did, the moment you wish had gone differently, the answer you never gave, the apology that never came, and the question your mind keeps asking as if one more replay might finally make it hurt less. But it never does. You were not meant to carry the same moment into every night. You were not meant to keep arguing with people who are no longer in the room. You were not meant to lose your peace trying to understand why someone chose to hurt you. Yet the mind does this when it does not know how to let go. It returns to the wound, hoping repetition will create closure. The Stoics understood something powerful about this. What happened belongs to the past. What they chose belongs to them. But what you keep giving your attention to now, that part is still yours. Peace begins when you stop trying to rewrite what cannot be changed and start protecting the mind that still has a life ahead of it. Tonight, that is what this meditation is for. 4 hours to quiet the replay. 4 hours to loosen your grip on the words, the betrayal, the disappointment, and the unanswered questions. 4 hours to return their actions to the past, so your mind can finally return to rest. And by morning, what they did may still be part of your story. But it will not have to be the first thing your mind reaches for anymore. And this is where the mind begins to reveal what it has really been doing all along. It was never simply remembering, it was searching for an ending. Some wounds stay loud because nothing about them felt complete. The conversation stopped too soon. The truth was never admitted. The apology never came. The person walked away before you could say what you needed to say. Or maybe they stayed, but they acted as if nothing serious had happened. And somewhere inside you, the mind quietly decided, this is not over yet. That is why the scene keeps returning. You can be lying in bed years later, perfectly safe, and suddenly hear their voice again in your head. You remember the exact sentence, the exact look on their face, the moment your stomach dropped. Then your mind starts working. You think of what you should have said. You create a better response. You picture them finally understanding. You picture yourself finally being heard. And for a few seconds it feels as if you are solving something. But you are not solving it. You are trying to complete something that reality already ended. That is one of the hardest truths to accept. The mind does not like unfinished things. It prefers clear endings. It wants the question answered. It wants the guilty person to admit what they did. It wants the conversation to reach a point where everything finally makes sense. But life does not always give you that kind of ending. Some people never explain themselves. Some people know exactly what they did and still refuse to admit it. Some people apologize without truly understanding the damage. Some people rewrite the story so completely that waiting for them to agree with your version becomes its own form of suffering. And sometimes the person disappears before any real closure is possible. The Stoics understood this problem deeply. They knew that suffering grows when peace depends on something outside your control. If your healing requires another person to confess, understand, regret, explain, or return, then your peace has been placed in their hands. And that is too much power to give anyone. The first thing to understand tonight is that an ending does not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes you have to create it within yourself, not by pretending the event did not matter, not by telling yourself that what they did was acceptable, not by forcing forgiveness before you are ready, but by deciding that your mind no longer has to wait at the scene. Think about what mental replay really is. It is often a form of waiting, waiting for a different answer, waiting for a better explanation, waiting for justice to arrive in exactly the form you wanted, waiting for the other person to finally become who you needed them to be. And while you wait, your mind keeps the door open. That open door is what allows the past to keep walking into the present. The Stoic response is not coldness, it is completion. You begin by saying something very simple to yourself. What happened is finished, even if I did not receive the ending I wanted. That sentence can feel uncomfortable because part of you may resist it. You may think, but they never answered me. True. They never admitted what they did. True. They never saw how much it hurt. Also true. But none of those facts make the event unfinished in reality. They make it emotionally unresolved, and those are not the same thing. Reality has already moved forward. The day changed. The conversation ended. The person left the room. Time continued. Your life continued. Only the mind stayed behind, standing in that old place asking one more question. This is where Stoic discipline becomes deeply practical. Instead of asking, how do I make them give me closure? Ask, what am I still waiting for? That question changes everything. Maybe you are waiting for an apology. Maybe you are waiting for them to say you were right. Maybe you want them to admit they lied. Maybe you want them to regret losing you. Maybe you want one final conversation where you finally say everything clearly. Name it. Do not judge yourself for wanting it. Just name it, because what you can name, you can begin to release. Now ask the next question. Is this something I control? If the answer is no, then you have found the source of the loop. Your mind has attached peace to an outcome it cannot command. And every night it returns to that impossible task. The Stoics would call you back to your own territory. Your judgment is yours. Your attention is yours. Your next action is yours. Your values are yours. Your interpretation of the event is yours. Their remorse is not. Their honesty is not. Their memory of what happened is not. Their willingness to understand you is not. This distinction is not just philosophy. It is freedom. Because once you stop assigning another person the job of finishing your pain, something inside begins to loosen. You no longer need their final sentence. You no longer need the perfect confrontation. You no longer need the ending to look fair. You begin to understand that closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes closure is a decision, a quiet one, a private one, a decision that says, I will not keep reopening this because someone else refused to close it properly. That is an internal ending, and it has real power. You can even create a simple practice before sleep. When the memory returns, do not enter the scene immediately. Do not argue. Do not rehearse. Do not build another version of the conversation. Pause. Then say, this already happened. Notice how different that is from saying, this should not have happened. The second sentence fights reality. The first one acknowledges it. Then say, there is nothing left for me to solve here tonight. That gives the mind a new instruction, because the mind often replays pain as if there is still a task to complete. Give it permission to stop working. You may also ask yourself, what lesson has already been taken from this? Maybe you learned to trust more slowly. Maybe you learned to speak up sooner. Maybe you learned that charm is not character. Maybe you learned that silence can sometimes tell you more than excuses. Once the lesson has been taken, the replay becomes less useful. You do not need to keep touching a hot surface to remember that it burns. This is important because some people confuse letting go with becoming careless. But Stoicism does not ask you to become naive. It asks you to stop paying twice, once through the original pain, and again through endless repetition. The event can remain part of your wisdom without remaining part of your nightly suffering. That is the balance. You remember enough to grow, but not so much that memory becomes a prison. And if the thought returns again tomorrow night, do not become angry with yourself. That would only create another struggle. Simply recognize what is happening. The mind thinks this is unfinished. Then answer it calmly. It is finished enough for me to rest. That sentence matters. Not perfectly finished, not fairly finished, not explained, not apologized for, just finished enough for you to stop standing at the door, finished enough for sleep, finished enough for breath, finished enough for your attention to return to the life that still belongs to you. Because sometimes the deepest closure is not hearing them finally say the right thing. It is realizing you no longer need them to. And once you stop waiting for the perfect ending, another hidden habit becomes easier to see. The mind does not only replay the past because it feels unfinished. Sometimes it turns the memory into a courtroom. Night after night you return to the same scene, gather the same evidence, defend the same version of events, and silently wait for a verdict that never comes. That is exhausting. You remember what they said. Then you remember what you said. You search for the exact moment when everything changed. You examine their tone, their silence, their excuses, their contradictions. You bring old messages back into your mind like exhibits. You replay conversations like testimony, and somewhere inside you are still trying to prove one thing, that your pain was real, that you were not wrong to feel hurt, that what happened mattered. But who are you trying to convince? That question can be uncomfortable. Sometimes you are trying to convince them, even though they are not there. Sometimes you are trying to convince people who never understood. And sometimes, without realizing it, you are trying to convince yourself. That is where memory becomes a courtroom. There is a judge in your head. There is a prosecutor. There is a witness. There is a defendant. And strangely, you are playing every role. One part of you says, they knew exactly what they were doing. Another part says, maybe I misunderstood. One part says, I should have seen it sooner. Another says, no, they deceived me. One part says, I had every right to walk away. Another whispers, but what if I overreacted? And so the trial continues. This is one reason painful memories can become so tiring. You are not simply remembering an event. You are constantly judging it. You are trying to reach a final conclusion that feels completely safe. The Stoics would tell you that this search can become another form of captivity, because peace does not always come from proving your case. Sometimes peace comes from refusing to keep trying the case at all. There is a difference. If something happened and you learned what you needed to learn from it, then continuing to gather evidence may no longer serve you. At some point, evidence stops becoming wisdom and starts becoming fuel. Fuel for anger, fuel for doubt, fuel for self-defense, fuel for another sleepless hour. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself not to waste his mind on things that no longer required action. That principle matters here. Ask yourself something simple. Is there anything useful I can do with this memory tonight? If the answer is no, then the trial is closed for the night. Not because the event did not matter, not because the other person was right, but because there is no useful decision left to make at 2 a.m. You do not need to prove your innocence to the ceiling. You do not need to defend your character to an empty room. You do not need to convince a memory. This is where many people lose years without realizing it. They keep building a case against someone who has already moved on. They collect examples. They did this too. And remember that time they said that? That proves they never cared. That proves I was right. Maybe you were right. But how many times must you prove it before you allow yourself to live? That is the deeper question. Being right and being free are not always the same thing. You can win every argument in your head and still lose your peace. Stoicism asks you to care more about freedom than victory. This does not mean becoming passive. If a situation requires action, take action, set a boundary, leave, speak clearly, protect yourself, correct a lie where it matters, seek justice where justice is possible. But once the useful action has been taken, the mind must eventually stop performing the case. Otherwise, you remain emotionally attached to the person through opposition. You may say, "I am done with them." But if you spend every night arguing with them in your head, some part of you is still in the relationship. Conflict can keep people connected just as strongly as affection. That is something few people notice. Hatred can be a rope. Resentment can be a rope. The need to prove someone wrong can be a rope. And sometimes freedom begins when you stop pulling on your end. You do not need the imaginary jury to agree with you. You do not need every friend to understand exactly what happened. You do not need the person who hurt you to suddenly confess and say, "Yes, you were right about everything." Your experience does not become real only after someone approves it. Your pain does not need a certificate. Your boundaries do not require a unanimous vote. And your peace should not depend on a verdict that exists only in your imagination. There is also another side to this courtroom habit. Sometimes the person on trial is you. You replay the past and accuse yourself. Why did I stay? Why did I trust them? Why didn't I say something? Why didn't I leave sooner? Now the courtroom becomes even crueler because you become both prosecutor and accused. But here is what Stoic wisdom asks you to remember. You acted with the understanding you had at the time. That does not mean every choice was wise. It means the past version of you did not possess today's knowledge. You can learn without humiliating yourself. You can admit mistakes without turning self-reflection into punishment. There is no wisdom in sentencing yourself every night for a decision you cannot reverse. The purpose of reflection is correction, not endless condemnation. Ask, "What will I do differently now?" That is useful. Ask, "How can I recognize this sooner next time?" Useful. Ask, "What boundary do I need now?" Useful. But asking, "How could I have been so stupid?" gives you nothing. It only creates another wound. The Stoic mind is disciplined enough to learn, then release. It doesn't keep reopening the same file simply because emotion wants another hearing. Tonight, when the courtroom begins to form again, notice the signs. You start rehearsing your defense. You begin building arguments. You hear their voice, you answer it. You call another witness from memory. You add another piece of evidence. That is the moment to stop. Not violently, not with frustration, just gently. Say to yourself, "There is no trial tonight." Then return to what is actually present. The room, the bed beneath you, your breathing, the quiet, the fact that the event is not happening now. That matters. The mind may still try to pull you back. It may say, "But you need to think about this." Ask, for what purpose? If there is no action to take, then thinking is no longer preparation. It is repetition, and repetition is not justice. You are allowed to leave the courtroom. You are allowed to stop defending yourself. You are allowed to stop proving what you already know. You are allowed to accept that some people will misunderstand your story forever. That is not defeat. It is emotional independence. Because the final goal is not to make the past agree with you. It is to make sure the past no longer controls the atmosphere of your present. And once you step out of that endless courtroom, something else becomes possible. You begin to see that one of the biggest reasons the mind keeps returning to the past is not only because it wants a verdict. It wants an explanation. It wants to know why. And sometimes that question can become even harder to release than the event itself. And this is where the next trap appears. Once the mind stops trying to prove what happened, it often shifts to a different obsession. It starts asking why. Why did they lie when the truth would have been easier? Why did they betray you after everything you gave? Why did they walk away without looking back? Why did they humiliate you, dismiss you, use you, or act as if your pain meant nothing? That question can follow you for years, because the mind believes that if it can just uncover the true motive, the pain will finally make sense. But that is not always true. Sometimes knowing why someone hurt you gives you more information, but not more peace. This is one of the hardest things to accept, because explanation feels like resolution. You think, if I could just understand what was going on in their mind, I could finally let this go. So you begin analyzing. Maybe they were jealous. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they never cared. Maybe they cared, but not enough. Maybe they were insecure. Maybe someone influenced them. Maybe they wanted control. Maybe they wanted attention. Maybe they wanted to punish you. The possibilities multiply, and the more possibilities you create, the more the mind stays attached. You are no longer living in what happened. You are living inside theories. That is dangerous because theories have no natural ending. There is always another possibility, another hidden reason, another explanation you have not considered, another detail that might change everything. And suddenly, understanding becomes its own form of captivity. The Stoics would ask a very simple question. Even if you knew the exact reason, what would actually change? Suppose they told you the truth tonight. Suppose they said, I lied because I was afraid. Would that erase the lie? Suppose they said, I betrayed you because I was selfish. Would that undo the betrayal? Suppose they said, I abandoned you because I wanted an easier life. Would that return the time you lost? The explanation may organize the story, but it does not rewrite it. That is the difference. Information can satisfy curiosity without healing the wound, and sometimes the search for motive becomes a way of avoiding the deeper work. Because as long as you are asking why they did it, your attention stays on them. Their childhood, their fears, their personality, their wounds, their intentions, their excuses, their psychology. But eventually, Stoicism turns the attention back toward the only place where you have real power. You, not why did they do this, but what will I do with what happened? That question is much stronger, because motive belongs to their inner world. Your response belongs to yours. You may never have access to the first, but you always have some influence over the second. That is where freedom begins. It begins when you stop requiring perfect understanding before you allow yourself to move forward. This does not mean that motives never matter. They can matter when you are deciding whether someone is safe. They can matter when you are deciding whether trust can be rebuilt. They can matter when you are learning from a pattern. But there is a point where understanding stops being useful and starts becoming emotional digging. You keep digging because you believe there must be one final answer beneath everything. But human beings are not always that simple. People can hurt you for reasons they barely understand themselves. They can act from fear and pride at the same time. They can love you and still behave selfishly. They can regret something and still refuse to admit it. They can tell you a reason that is only partly true. And sometimes they can give you an explanation that creates even more questions. That is why peace cannot depend entirely on confession. If your calm requires another person to become fully honest with themselves, you may be waiting forever. The Stoic path is different. It says, I do not need access to every hidden room in another person's mind. That is powerful, because so much suffering comes from trying to enter rooms that were never yours. You want to know what they were thinking, what they really felt, whether they miss you, whether they regret it, whether they know they were wrong, whether they ever think about what happened. But notice what all of these questions have in common. They place your peace inside another person's mind, a place you cannot control, a place you may never enter. Tonight, you can release that demand. You can say, I know enough. Maybe you do not know every motive, but perhaps you know enough about the behavior. They lied, they disappeared, they crossed a boundary, they broke trust, they showed you something important. That may be enough. You do not need to know every reason behind a fire before you stop touching the flame. Sometimes behavior is the information. That alone can be a complete lesson. This is especially important when someone gives you an explanation that tempts you to excuse what should not be excused. They say they were stressed. They say they were confused. They say they were going through something. And perhaps all of that is true. But an explanation and an excuse are not the same thing. Stoic wisdom allows you to understand someone without surrendering your judgment. You can say, I understand why you may have acted that way, and I still know it was harmful. Both can be true. Compassion does not require self-betrayal. Understanding does not require reopening the door. And forgiveness, if it ever comes, does not require pretending the behavior was acceptable. That is emotional maturity, not knowing everything, but knowing what matters. The mind often resists this because mystery feels unsafe. It thinks, if I do not understand why this happened, I cannot protect myself. But complete knowledge is never available. You cannot build a life with zero uncertainty. No one can. Stoicism teaches you to become strong enough to live without every answer. That is much more powerful than trying to collect all of them, because eventually you realize something. The question, why did they do this, may never receive an answer that feels big enough for the pain. Sometimes the reason is painfully ordinary. Selfishness, cowardice, immaturity, convenience, fear, weak character. And after all your searching, you may discover there was no deep mystery at all. That can be disappointing, but it can also be freeing, because then the search ends. You stop giving the event more complexity than it deserves. You stop turning their behavior into a puzzle you must solve before you can sleep. You stop studying someone who is no longer responsible for your future. And tonight, if the question returns, do not fight it. Just answer it differently. Maybe I will never know. Then add something stronger. And I can still be at peace. That is the sentence the mind rarely expects, because it has been trained to believe that peace comes after explanation. But sometimes peace comes first. Sometimes you move forward with unanswered questions. Sometimes you heal without the confession. Sometimes you become free without ever understanding what was going on inside the person who hurt you. And that is not an incomplete ending, that is wisdom. Because eventually the most important question is no longer why they did what they did. It is why you should continue giving their motive a place in your mind tonight. And once you stop demanding an explanation, another hidden expectation begins to surface. It is quieter than anger, but often stronger. Part of you may still be waiting for the day they finally understand what they did. Not just understand it in words. Feel it. Feel the weight of it. Feel the damage. Feel the regret. Feel the kind of guilt that seems equal to the pain you carried, and that waiting can keep you tied to them for far longer than you realize. You may tell yourself that you have moved on, but somewhere inside you are still hoping life will teach them the lesson you could not. You want them to wake up one day and finally see everything clearly. You want them to remember your face, your trust, your loyalty, the way you were there for them. You want something inside them to collapse under the truth, because if they truly understood, then maybe the pain would finally feel acknowledged. But this is where Stoic wisdom becomes difficult. You cannot control the conscience of another person. You cannot decide when they become honest. You cannot force remorse into someone who protects themselves with denial. You cannot make another person feel guilty in the exact way you think they should. And if your peace depends on that moment, then your peace is still waiting inside their character. That is too dangerous. Because some people never feel guilt the way you expect. Some feel it briefly, then excuse themselves. Some turn guilt into anger. Some blame the person they hurt because accepting responsibility would damage the image they have of themselves. Some change the story in their own mind until they become the victim. And some simply move forward without ever looking deeply at what they did. That can feel deeply unfair. Because you carried the consequences while they seemed to carry nothing. You lost sleep. You questioned yourself. You became more careful. You struggled to trust again. And they appeared to continue living normally. That contrast can create a special kind of pain. You do not only want justice. You want emotional balance. You want their inner world to somehow reflect what happened in yours. But life does not promise that. The Stoics knew this very well. They understood that other people act according to their own judgment, their own understanding, their own character. A person with poor judgment may do harm and still believe they were justified. That does not make the harm acceptable. It means their conscience is not a reliable place to store your peace. Think about how much energy is spent waiting for someone to become guilty in the right way. You picture them alone. You wonder if they think about you. You wonder if they regret losing you. You wonder if they finally understand. You may even check their life from a distance, searching for evidence that consequences have arrived. Maybe a relationship failed. Maybe they seem unhappy. Maybe someone treated them the way they treated you. And for a moment you feel relief. Now they know. But notice what has happened. Your emotional state is still responding to their life. Their happiness disturbs you. Their suffering satisfies you. Their success feels unfair. Their failure feels like justice. You are still connected. The rope has changed shape, but it is still there. Stoicism asks for something more difficult than revenge: independence. True independence means their emotional punishment is no longer required for your healing. That does not mean you suddenly wish them well. It does not mean you become kind toward someone who remains dangerous. It does not mean consequences should disappear. It simply means your peace no longer waits for their suffering. This is a powerful distinction. Justice may still matter. Boundaries may still matter. Truth may still matter. But peace must come from somewhere deeper than watching another person finally hurt. Because what happens if they never do? What happens if they live comfortably? What happens if they never apologize? What happens if they tell themselves a story where they did nothing wrong? Will you allow their lack of conscience to become your lifelong punishment? That would mean they hurt you once through their actions and continue hurting you through the guilt they refuse to feel. You do not have to accept that arrangement. You can step out of it. You can say, their conscience is their responsibility. My mind is mine. That is a Stoic boundary. And it is one of the strongest boundaries you can create. It separates moral responsibility from emotional dependence. They are responsible for what they did. You are responsible for what you continue to carry. Those two truths can exist at the same time. One does not cancel the other. There is also something else worth noticing. Sometimes wanting them to feel guilty is really a desire to be seen. You want them to understand because you want proof that your pain mattered. You want remorse because remorse seems to confirm your value. If they regret losing you, then maybe you were important. If they feel ashamed, then maybe you were right. If they suffer, then maybe what happened was truly serious. But your worth does not need to be confirmed by their regret. Your pain does not become valid only when the person who caused it agrees. A wound does not become real when the knife apologizes. It was real when it happened, and this is where you begin taking your dignity back. Not by convincing them, not by waiting for their conscience to wake up, but by refusing to use their remorse as evidence of your value. You already know what you experienced. You already know what it cost you. You already know what you had to rebuild. That knowledge is enough. There is another danger in waiting for guilt. It can quietly turn into a wish for suffering. You may not want terrible things to happen to them, but you want something painful enough to make them understand. That thought is human, but if you feed it every night, it changes you. The person who hurt you begins shaping your inner character. Their cruelty produces your bitterness. Their selfishness produces your obsession. Their lack of remorse produces your desire for punishment. And now they are still influencing who you become. Stoicism asks you to protect something even more valuable than your feelings, your character. You do not control what they became, but you still have influence over what you become because of them. That is your territory. You can become wiser without becoming hard, more careful without becoming suspicious of everyone, stronger without becoming cruel, less dependent on apologies without becoming emotionally numb. That is victory. Not seeing them suffer, not watching karma arrive, not hearing them finally say, "I was wrong." Victory is reaching a point where none of that is required anymore. Tonight, if you find yourself wondering whether they regret it, notice what the question is asking from you. It is asking you to leave your own mind and enter theirs. Do not go. Stay here. Stay with what belongs to you. Your breath, your choices, your values, your rest, your future. Say quietly, "Their remorse is not required for my peace." The mind may resist that at first. It may say, "But they should feel guilty." Perhaps they should. That is not the same as saying you must wait for it. There are many things in life that should happen and do not. People should tell the truth. People should keep promises. People should admit when they cause harm. But Stoic peace is built for the world as it is, not only for the world as it should be. And that is why it is so strong. You can still believe they were wrong. You can still believe they should take responsibility. You can still refuse to welcome them back, but you no longer need to sit beside the door of their conscience, waiting for it to open. Let that door remain closed if it must. Your life has another door, one that opens forward, and the moment you stop waiting for them to become guilty in the right way, you begin to see something else more clearly. You begin to notice how often the mind does not only want them to change, it wants to go back and change you. And this is where the mind often turns away from them and turns against you. Once you stop asking why they did it, another voice rises in the quiet. A harsher one. Why didn't I see it? Why did I stay? Why didn't I say something? Why didn't I leave sooner? That voice can make an old wound feel new again, because now you are no longer only replaying what they did. You are rewriting who you were. You go back into the memory carrying everything you know today. You enter that old room with your present wisdom, your present strength, your present understanding, and then judge the person you were for not having any of it yet. That is an unfair trial, and the mind does it constantly. You remember the first warning sign and think, "I should have known." You remember the strange comment, the change in their behavior, the promise that did not quite make sense. "I should have noticed." You remember staying after something felt wrong. "I should have walked away." You remember the moment they insulted you and you froze instead of responding. "I should have said this." Then the mind gives you the perfect sentence. Of course it does. It has had months, perhaps years, to prepare it. The person you were in that moment had seconds. There is a deep difference between wisdom after an event and wisdom during it. Stoicism asks you to respect that difference. You cannot take knowledge that pain taught you later and demand that your former self should have possessed it earlier. That is like standing at the end of a road, looking backward and criticizing yourself for not seeing every turn before you traveled it. The road looks obvious from here. It did not look obvious from there. That matters. One of the most common ways people keep suffering is through counterfactual thinking. The mind creates an alternate past and compares reality against it. If I had left that night, none of this would have happened. If I had listened to my instincts, I would have saved myself years. If I had said no, they would never have had that power over me. If I had confronted them earlier, everything would have changed. Maybe. But notice the word hiding inside every one of those thoughts. If and if can become a very expensive word, because the mind can build an entire world behind it, a world where you noticed everything, a world where you never trusted the wrong person, a world where you gave the perfect response, a world where you were never afraid, confused, hopeful, attached, tired, shocked, or human. And then you punish your real self for failing to behave like this imaginary person. That is not reflection. That is self-revision. Useful reflection asks, what did this teach me? Endless self-revision asks, how can I mentally go back and become someone else? One can change your future, the other only tortures your past. The Stoics placed enormous value on examining your actions. They did not teach people to avoid responsibility. In fact, Stoic practice requires honesty. If you ignored something important, admit it. If you abandoned your own boundary, recognize it. If fear kept you silent, learn from it. If you gave trust too quickly, become wiser. But once the lesson becomes clear, the purpose of examination has been fulfilled. You do not need to keep striking yourself with it. A lesson should become guidance, not a weapon. This distinction is powerful. You can say, I would handle that differently today. That is growth. You can say, I was an idiot for not knowing better. That is punishment. You can say, now I understand what that behavior meant. That is clarity. You can say, I should have understood it immediately. That is demanding impossible foresight. You can say, next time I will speak sooner. That is preparation. You can spend another night rehearsing what you should have said 10 years ago. That changes nothing. Stoicism keeps pulling you toward what can still be acted upon. That is one of its great mercies. The past cannot receive your new wisdom, but tomorrow can. So give the lesson to tomorrow. Do not keep sending it backward. There is also something tender underneath many of these thoughts. When you say, I should have known, sometimes what you are really saying is, I wish I could have protected myself. That is different. Perhaps the anger you feel toward your former self is actually grief. You look backward and see someone walking toward pain without knowing it, and now you want to run into the scene. You want to warn them. You want to grab their hand. You want to say, do not trust this. Leave now. Speak up. You deserve better. But you cannot enter that day again. You cannot rescue the person you were by changing what happened. You can honor them by protecting the person you are now. That is where the energy belongs. You could not go back and give them the boundary. But you can have the boundary today. You could not give them the confidence. You can practice it today. You could not tell them what the warning sign meant. You recognize it now. That is how the past becomes useful without becoming a prison. You carry forward the wisdom, not the punishment. and be careful with the belief that there was always one perfect choice available. Human situations are rarely that clean. Maybe you stayed because you loved someone. Maybe you believed their apology. Maybe you wanted to give them another chance. Maybe leaving carried consequences you were not prepared for. Maybe you were confused. Maybe the harmful behavior happened slowly enough that each individual moment seemed survivable. Looking backward compresses everything. Years become a few memories. Patterns that took months to reveal now appear obvious in 5 minutes of reflection. The present mind sees the complete picture. The past mind received one piece at a time. Do not forget that. Sometimes you also judge yourself for freezing when you think you should have fought back. Someone insulted you. Someone humiliated you. Someone revealed something shocking, and you said nothing. Later, your mind becomes brilliant. It creates the perfect reply while you are brushing your teeth. It delivers a powerful speech while you are driving. At midnight, suddenly you know exactly what you should have said, and then you feel weak because you did not say it. But being shocked is not the same as being weak. Human beings do not always respond immediately when something unexpected happens. Sometimes the mind needs time to understand what it has just experienced. You are allowed to have needed that time. You do not have to turn every delayed response into evidence against yourself. The better question is not, why wasn't I perfect then? The better question is, what do I know now? That is a Stoic question, because it puts you back in the present, and the present is where your power lives. Tonight, when your mind begins editing the scene again, notice it. You will recognize the language. I should have. I could have. If only. That is your signal. Do not argue with the thought. Complete it differently. I should have known. No. I know now. I should have left sooner. No. I know what I will no longer stay for. I should have spoken. No. I know what deserves my voice now. Feel the difference. One direction moves backward. The other moves forward. One punishes. The other prepares. One asks an old version of you to become wiser. The other allows the current version of you to actually use the wisdom. This is how regret becomes instruction. This is how memory stops being a place where you repeatedly fail and becomes a place where you learned. And perhaps tonight you can offer your former self something they have been waiting a long time to receive from you. Not another accusation, not another correction, not another speech about what they should have done. Understanding. They did not know what I know now. Let that sentence settle. They were doing what they could with the clarity they had, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps fearfully, perhaps with mistakes you would never repeat today, but they carried you far enough for you to become the person who can now see more clearly. Do not spend that new clarity attacking them. Use it to protect what comes next, because the person you were does not need you to keep going back and rescuing them. They need you to stop abandoning the person you are now, and this is where the memory becomes even heavier, because sometimes you are not only remembering what happened, you are remembering the meaning you attached to it. That meaning can hurt more than the event itself. Someone betrayed you, and the mind says, I was foolish. Someone replaced you, and the mind says, I was never enough. Someone ignored your loyalty, and the mind says, I was never valued. Someone lied to you, and the mind says, I should never trust myself again. Now the wound has changed. It is no longer only about them. It has become a story about you. And that is where Stoic discipline becomes deeply important. The Stoics made a sharp distinction between what happens and the judgment we place on what happens. The event is one thing. The meaning you assign to it is another. Those two things can feel fused together, but they are not the same. Someone leaving is an event. I was disposable is a judgment. Someone lying is an event. I was stupid for believing them is a judgment. Someone choosing another person is an event. I was not worth choosing is a judgment. Someone humiliating you is an event. I must be weak is a judgment. The event may be painful, but the judgment can keep renewing the pain long after the event is over. This is why some memories feel almost alive. Each time the memory returns, it carries the same verdict about who you are. And if you never separate the two, you may start treating the judgment as fact. That is dangerous, because another person's behavior can reveal something about their character without revealing the final truth about yours. Their betrayal may reveal their disloyalty. It does not automatically reveal your foolishness. Their dishonesty may reveal their lack of integrity. It does not automatically mean you were stupid to trust. Their rejection may reveal their preference. It does not define your value. Their inability to appreciate you may reveal the limits of their perception. It does not prove that you had nothing worth appreciating. This sounds simple, but when you are hurt, the mind rarely stays this clear. Pain likes to personalize everything. It says, if they did this to me, there must be something wrong with me. That is the trap. The mind would rather blame itself than accept uncertainty, because self-blame creates the illusion of control. If the problem was you, then maybe you can fix everything by becoming better, smarter, quieter, stronger, more attractive, more useful, less emotional, less trusting, more careful. But what if the truth is more uncomfortable? What if someone hurt you because of who they were, not because of what you lacked? That can be harder to accept because it means you could not have controlled the outcome by becoming perfect. And yet that truth can also set you free. You were never required to become impossible to mistreat. No human being can do that. Even wise people are betrayed. Strong people are deceived. Kind people are abandoned. Loyal people are taken for granted. Intelligent people miss warning signs. Good people are sometimes treated badly. The Stoic response is not to say, nothing matters. It is to stop turning every external event into a definition of the self. You can learn from what happened without becoming what happened. That distinction changes everything. Suppose someone cheated on you. The event may tell you something about the relationship. It may tell you something about boundaries, character, or trust. But if your mind turns it into, I was not enough, then you have accepted a conclusion the event itself never proved. Someone can betray a loving person. Someone can leave a valuable person. Someone can lie to someone who deserved honesty. Someone can fail to appreciate something precious. Human behavior is not always a fair measurement system. That is why your worth cannot be placed in another person's hands. If you do that, then every change in their behavior becomes a change in your identity. When they love you, you feel valuable. When they withdraw, you feel worthless. When they praise you, you feel strong. When they criticize you, you collapse. That is not freedom. Stoicism teaches you to build identity around character rather than reaction. Ask yourself different questions. Was I honest? Was I loyal? Did I act with courage where I could? Did I try to behave with dignity? Did I learn when I saw that something was wrong? These questions belong to you. That is your territory. Their judgment of you is not. Their ability to value you is not. Their decision to stay or leave is not. Their emotional maturity is not. Once you understand this, the memory begins to lose one of its sharpest edges. You can remember what happened without repeating the old sentence about yourself. That sentence may have been living inside you for years. I was not worth staying for. Question it. Is that fact, or is that pain speaking? I was so stupid. Is that fact? Or are you judging your past self with information you gained later? I meant nothing to them. Do you truly know that? Or are you using their harmful behavior to explain their entire inner world? Stoic practice asks you to examine impressions before accepting them. An impression is the first interpretation that rushes into the mind. This proves I am not enough. This proves everyone leaves. This proves I cannot trust myself. The Stoic does not immediately obey that thought. They pause. They ask, is this actually true? That pause creates space, and space creates freedom. The memory may say, you were replaceable. You answer, someone chose differently. That is not the same thing as saying, I have no value. The memory says, you were foolish. You answer, I trusted based on what I understood then. The memory says, you were never valued. You answer, another person's failure to value me is not the measure of my worth. This is not positive thinking. It is accurate thinking. There is a difference. Positive thinking sometimes tries to cover pain with comforting words. Stoic thinking tries to remove false conclusions. You are not saying the betrayal was good. You are saying it does not get to define you. You are not saying the rejection did not hurt. You are saying pain is not proof of inferiority. You are not saying you made no mistakes. You are saying mistakes are not identities. That is a much stronger foundation. There is another reason this matters. When you attach identity to injury, you begin protecting the identity instead of healing the wound. If you decide, I am someone people betray, you start expecting betrayal. If you decide, I am not worth choosing, you may accept less. If you decide, I cannot trust myself, you may become afraid to make decisions. The old event begins shaping new behavior. This is how the past quietly enters the future. Not through memory alone, through identity. And Stoicism cuts that chain. It says, what happened to me is not the same as who I am. Say that slowly. What happened to me is not who I am. That is one of the cleanest ways to separate an event from a judgment. You experienced betrayal. You are not betrayal. You experienced rejection. You are not rejection. You experienced humiliation. You are not humiliation. You made a mistake. You are not the mistake. This is where dignity returns, not through pretending you were untouched, but through refusing to build your identity from someone else's worst behavior. Tonight, when the memory comes back, notice what sentence arrives with it. Not just the picture, not just the person. Listen for the meaning. What does the memory say about you? That is the part to examine. Because perhaps the memory itself is not the true source of the pain anymore. Perhaps it is the conclusion attached to it, and conclusions can be questioned. They can be corrected. They can be released. The past may remain exactly the same, but the meaning does not have to. That is one of the quiet powers of Stoic wisdom. You cannot rewrite the event, but you can stop letting the event write your identity. And once you separate what happened from what you made it mean about you, another truth becomes easier to see. The person in the memory may no longer be standing in front of you at all, but a version of them may still be living inside your mind. And once you separate what happened from what it made you believe about yourself, something even stranger becomes visible. The person who hurt you may no longer be in the room. They may be miles away. They may be gone from your life completely. And yet, somehow, they still speak. Their voice appears in your head. Their criticism returns. Their rejection returns. Their silence returns. Their face appears in old scenes. You answer them. You defend yourself. You explain. You become angry. You feel small again. And for a moment, the past feels present, but it is not present. That is the first thing to understand. Rumination creates an internal version of a person and then reacts to that version as if they are still here. This is one of the quietest ways the past keeps control. The real person may no longer have access to your home, your phone, your time, or your life. But the version in your mind still has access to your attention. That matters. Because attention is where emotional life happens. You can remove someone physically and still carry them mentally. You can stop speaking to them and still spend hours speaking to them inside your own head. You can block their number and still leave the door to your mind wide open. And that is where Stoic discipline begins. Not with forcing the memory away, but with recognizing what it actually is. A reconstruction, a mental image, a replay, an impression, not a current event. The Stoics were deeply interested in this distinction. They taught that the mind receives impressions, but you do not have to treat every impression as truth, command, or reality. That principle is powerful at night, because when the mind is tired, an old memory can feel immediate. You remember the way they looked at you and suddenly your body reacts. Your chest tightens, your stomach turns, your jaw becomes tense. You feel the same anger, the same fear, the same shame. But ask yourself one simple question. Are they here? Not emotionally, not symbolically, literally. Are they here? Usually the answer is no. The room is quiet. The door is closed. The conversation is not happening. The insult is not being spoken. The betrayal is not occurring. The rejection is not taking place. What you are experiencing is the echo, and an echo can sound real without being new. That is important. Because every time you respond to the echo as if the original event is happening again, you give the memory fresh energy. You begin another argument. You say what you wish you had said. You defend your motives. You prove your innocence. You explain why they were wrong, and suddenly the internal version of that person has pulled you into another conversation they are not even having. This is why rumination can feel so unfair. The other person may be sleeping peacefully somewhere while you are still attending a meeting with their memory. They are absent. But your nervous system does not know that until you remind it. This is where you can begin practicing something simple. When the voice appears, name it correctly. That is a memory. When the old argument begins, say, "That conversation is over." When their face appears, say, "This is an image in my mind." These statements may sound small, but they create distance. And distance is powerful, because suffering becomes stronger when memory and reality collapse into each other. The moment you separate them, the present begins returning. You hear the room again. You notice the bed. You feel the air. You notice your breathing. You remember where you actually are. This is the present. And the present has different rules. The present does not require you to defend yourself against someone who is not there. The present does not require you to answer an insult from years ago. The present does not require you to win an old argument. The present simply asks you to be here. That sounds easy, but it is a discipline. Because the mind likes familiar battles, even painful ones. A familiar enemy can sometimes feel easier than an uncertain future. So the mind returns to what it knows. The same face, the same words, the same wound. It knows the script. And every time you enter the script, the internal person becomes stronger. This is why you must stop feeding the reconstruction, not by hatred, not by force, by refusing participation. Think of it this way. Someone knocks on your mental door. You recognize the voice. You already know what conversation is waiting on the other side. You do not have to open. That is the choice. The thought can appear without becoming an event. The memory can knock without being invited inside. This is a deeply Stoic way of living. You do not control which thought appears first, but you have influence over whether you continue with it. There is another important distinction here. The person in your mind is not even the complete person who existed then. It is a version built by memory. Memory selects. Memory compresses. Memory repeats certain details and forgets others. Over time, the internal version may become more extreme than the actual person ever was. The insult becomes louder. The rejection becomes sharper. The face becomes colder. The memory gets polished through repetition until it becomes almost symbolic. Now you are no longer only remembering a person. You are carrying a character your mind created from the most painful moments. And then you react to that character. This does not mean your memory is false. It means memory is not a live recording. It is an experience being reconstructed. That understanding gives you another form of freedom. You do not need to defeat the internal person. You do not need to prove anything to them. You do not need to make them apologize in your head. You simply need to stop treating the reconstruction as a current relationship. That is all, because this is what often happens after hurt. The external relationship ends. The internal relationship continues, and sometimes the internal relationship becomes more intense than the real one ever was. You spend more time with them in your mind after they leave than you did when they were present. That is a painful thought, but it is also a liberating one. Because once you see it, you can change it. Tonight, when their voice comes back, do something different. Do not answer immediately. Listen. Then ask, whose voice is this now? It may sound like them, but it is happening inside your mind. That means it is now part of your inner world. And your inner world deserves boundaries too. You would not allow someone to enter your home every night and insult you, so why allow their mental image to do it without interruption? Create the boundary. This voice does not get to speak to me this way anymore. That is not pretending they never said it. It is refusing to continue the conversation. There is a difference. You can also replace the old voice with your own judgment. Perhaps they told you that you were difficult. You do not have to keep hearing it as truth. Perhaps they said you would never succeed. You do not have to keep giving that sentence authority. Perhaps they made you feel unwanted. You do not have to keep carrying their perception as your identity. The internal person often survives through borrowed authority. You still treat their words as if they have the right to define something. Stoicism asks you to examine that authority. Why should someone who acted without wisdom become the permanent narrator of your mind? Why should a person who lacked honesty become the voice you use to judge yourself? Why should someone who did not understand you become the final interpreter of who you are? They should not. And the moment you see that clearly, the voice loses some of its weight. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for a little quiet. Enough for a little distance. Enough to remember that the voice belongs to memory, not to the room. There is something else you can practice. When the old scene returns, change your position in it. Do not enter as the person being attacked. Observe it as something that already happened. See the difference. One way says, "This is happening to me." The other says, "I am remembering something that happened." Those sentences create completely different inner experiences. The second brings you back into time. It reminds you that there is a before and an after. The event belongs to the before. You are living in the after. That is where your life is now. You do not need to invite the past into every quiet moment just because the mind knows how to find it. The person in your head may continue appearing for a while. That is normal. But appearance is not access. A memory can appear without being obeyed. A voice can appear without being answered. A face can appear without becoming the center of your night. And each time you refuse to enter the old exchange, you weaken the pattern. Not by fighting, by starving it of participation. Eventually, the voice becomes quieter. The scene becomes flatter. The emotional charge begins to loosen. Not because you erased the person, but because you stopped giving their internal version new life. And this is one of the quiet victories of Stoic practice. You realize that someone can leave your life twice, once physically and once mentally. The second departure may take longer, but it is often the one that finally gives you peace. And once the person in your head begins to lose their power, another fear often appears. You may worry that if the memory becomes quieter, you are somehow betraying yourself. As if letting go means saying it was acceptable. As if sleeping peacefully means it did not matter. As if no longer feeling the same anger means you have forgotten what happened. But healing does not require amnesia. You are allowed to remember clearly without remaining emotionally available to the past. That distinction changes everything. There is a difference between memory and emotional occupation. Memory says, "This happened." Emotional occupation says, "And I must keep feeling it as if it is still happening." Memory can teach you. Emotional occupation drains you. Memory can sharpen your judgment. Emotional occupation keeps your body waiting for an old danger. Stoicism does not ask you to erase the event. It asks you to stop giving the event more of your present life than it deserves. That is not denial. That is proportion. Think about how often people confuse pain with loyalty to the truth. They think, if I stop being angry, then I am letting them off the hook. But your anger is not a courtroom sentence. Your insomnia is not justice. Your anxiety is not evidence. You do not have to suffer continuously in order to prove that what happened was wrong. The wrongness of the event does not increase because you replay it, and it does not decrease because you finally rest. This is one of the quietest forms of freedom. You can say, "I remember," and still say, "I am not going back there tonight." Both can be true. You can remember the betrayal without rebuilding the betrayal. You can remember the insult without hearing it in the same emotional volume. You can remember that someone crossed a boundary without reopening the boundary in your mind every night. The lesson remains. The emotional charge does not have to. That is what mature healing looks like. Not forgetting, not pretending, not minimizing, but changing your relationship to the memory. At first, the memory may feel like a wound. Later, it can become information. That is a powerful transformation. A wound demands attention. Information gives guidance. A wound says, "Look what they did to me." Information says, "Now I know what I will not accept again." A wound says, "This still controls me." Information says, "This taught me something." The event itself does not change. Your position toward it does. The Stoics were deeply concerned with this inner position. They understood that an external event may enter your life once, but your judgment can invite it back thousands of times. That is where emotional energy becomes important. Every time you replay the scene with full intensity, you feed it. You give it breath. You give it movement. You give it present tense. You take something old and make it fresh. That is why some memories still feel so close after years, not because time failed, because attention kept returning with the same emotional force. This does not mean you are to blame for the memory. It means you have a place to practice. You cannot always control what rises, but you can learn not to pour more energy into it. This is the skill. When a memory appears, you do not need to push it away. Pushing often makes it louder. You do not need to follow it either. You can acknowledge it. Yes, that happened. Then stop. Do not add the speech. Do not add the fantasy. Do not add the accusation. Do not add the question about what they are doing now. Do not add another imagined ending. Let the memory remain as a fact. A fact needs much less energy than a drama. That is how you begin withdrawing emotional availability. You stop being endlessly available for the same old conversation. You stop volunteering your body to relive the same stress. You stop giving every remembered detail a full emotional response. This may feel strange at first. You may even feel guilty. You may think, why does this not hurt as much anymore? That question reveals something important. Part of you may have linked pain with importance. You think that if it mattered, it should always hurt. But that is not true. Something can matter deeply and still become quiet. A scar proves that a wound existed. It does not need to bleed forever to remain real. The same is true for memory. You can carry the knowledge without carrying the injury in its original form. That is not forgetting. That is integration. You have taken the event into your understanding instead of letting it dominate your nervous system. And that is a much healthier kind of remembering. There is another trap here. Sometimes people keep emotional pain alive because they are afraid of becoming careless. They think, if I relax, I will trust the wrong person again. So they keep the memory sharp. They revisit it as a warning. They think fear will protect them. But wisdom protects better than fear. Fear says, never trust anyone. Wisdom says, watch for patterns. Fear says, everyone will hurt you. Wisdom says, pay attention to consistency. Fear says, keep your guard up forever. Wisdom says, have boundaries. You do not need to remain emotionally wounded in order to remain intelligent. In fact, a calmer mind often sees more clearly. A mind flooded by old pain may misread everything. It may see danger where there is none. It may expect betrayal before evidence appears. It may punish new people for old behavior. That is not protection. That is the past expanding its territory. Stoicism asks you to reduce that territory, not by becoming naive, by becoming precise. Keep the lesson. Release the excess. Keep the boundary. Release the obsession. Keep the discernment. Release the nightly replay. Keep the memory. Release the need to feel it at full strength. This is how emotional freedom becomes practical. You may even ask yourself, what part of this memory still serves me? Perhaps it taught you to listen to actions more than promises. Keep that. Perhaps it taught you to leave sooner when respect disappears. Keep that. Perhaps it taught you not to ignore your own discomfort. Keep that. Now ask, what part no longer serves me? The repeated argument? The fantasy of revenge? The desire to know whether they regret it? The need to feel angry every time their name appears? That can go. This is how you separate wisdom from emotional weight. The event becomes lighter because you have taken what was useful and stopped carrying what was not. There is no stoic virtue in carrying unnecessary pain. Endurance matters when something must be endured, but carrying what no longer needs to be carried is not strength. Sometimes strength is putting it down. Tonight, if the memory returns, try this. Do not ask, how do I forget this? Ask, how do I remember this without entering it? That is a better question. You remember from the shore instead of swimming back into the storm. You see what happened without becoming the person inside the scene again. You say, yes, that was part of my life. Not, that is still my life. Feel the difference. One sentence keeps time moving, the other freezes it. You are allowed to move. You are allowed to become someone for whom the memory is no longer central. You are allowed to laugh without thinking of them. You are allowed to trust carefully again. You are allowed to have peaceful nights. You are allowed to hear their name and feel less. You are allowed to stop checking whether the wound still hurts. None of this erases the truth. In fact, it may mean you have finally accepted it fully enough that you no longer need to fight it, because acceptance is not saying it was okay. Acceptance is saying it happened, and I refuse to keep sacrificing the present to it. That is deeply Stoic. The past can remain a teacher without remaining a master. It can sit quietly on the shelf of your life instead of sleeping beside you every night. And eventually, you may notice something beautiful. You still remember, but the memory no longer demands anything from you. No argument, no tears, no explanation, no defense. It is simply there, a piece of history, a lesson, a mark on the road behind you. And that is when you begin to understand that healing was never about forgetting what happened. It was about becoming unavailable to the pain that kept asking you to live there. And once you learn to remember without reopening the wound, another source of suffering begins to show itself. Sometimes the pain is not only about what happened, it is about the fact that part of you still believes reality should somehow admit that it was unfair. That belief can keep a person stuck for years. You know what happened was wrong. You know you did not deserve it. You know the ending was not fair. And because you know that, the mind keeps returning to the same silent protest. This should not have happened. They should not have treated me that way. I should have been given more. I should have been protected. I should have received the truth. And maybe every one of those statements is true. But truth alone does not change what already happened. This is where Stoic acceptance becomes uncomfortable. Acceptance does not mean approval. It does not mean saying the betrayal was acceptable. It does not mean pretending the injustice was harmless. It means recognizing that reality has already taken the shape it took, and arguing with that shape does not reshape it. That is the painful part. The mind wants fairness to travel backward. It wants life to reopen the scene. It wants the wrong choice corrected. It wants the person to act differently. It wants the missing apology inserted. It wants the lost years returned. It wants the ending repaired. But life does not move backward. And every time you demand that the past become different before you allow yourself peace, you create a condition reality cannot meet. That is where pride sometimes hides. Not loud pride, not arrogance, a quieter pride. The belief that because something should not have happened, your mind must keep resisting the fact that it did. You feel that accepting reality would somehow dishonor what was wrong. But resistance does not honor you. It only keeps you tied to the event. There is a difference between saying, "That was unjust," and saying, "Reality must still answer to me for being unjust." The first is clarity. The second becomes a lifelong argument, and the past never enters the courtroom to defend itself. The Stoics understood that suffering grows when we confuse preference with control. You can prefer honesty, you can prefer loyalty, you can prefer fairness. You can expect respect, you can choose people who value those things, but you cannot force reality to guarantee them. That is not cynicism, it is emotional preparation. Because if you demand that life always behave fairly before you are willing to be peaceful, then your peace will always be fragile. Someone will disappoint you. Something will end too soon. A good person will suffer. A dishonest person may prosper. Someone who hurt you may never face the consequence you expected. And the mind will say, "This is not how it should be." Maybe not, but it is how it is. That sentence can feel cold at first. This is how it is. But there is enormous strength inside it, because it ends the argument with reality. Not the moral judgment, the argument. You can still say, "It was wrong." and also say, "It happened." Those two sentences belong together. One protects your values, the other protects your peace. This is one of the most important Stoic distinctions. Acceptance is not moral surrender, it is factual surrender. You surrender the demand that an irreversible event become reversible. That is all. You stop trying to negotiate with what has already happened. And when you stop negotiating, a surprising amount of energy returns. Think about how much effort it takes to keep saying, "But it should have been different." The mind builds alternate versions. It compares them. It revisits the loss. It measures the gap between what happened and what should have happened. And every comparison produces pain. You are not only suffering the event, you are suffering the distance between reality and expectation. That distance can become endless. Because the ideal past is always cleaner. In the ideal past, they told the truth. In the ideal past, they stayed. In the ideal past, they treated you with care. In the ideal past, you saw the warning signs. In the ideal past, justice came quickly. But the ideal past does not exist. Only the real one does, and the real one cannot be changed. Stoicism asks you to place your strength in the only direction where change remains possible. Forward. Not because the past is unimportant, but because the past is complete, your response is not. This is where many people misunderstand acceptance. They think acceptance means giving up, but accepting what cannot be changed allows you to act more intelligently on what can. You stop wasting energy demanding a different history. Then you use that energy to build a different future. That is not defeat. That is discipline. You can choose better relationships. You can create stronger boundaries. You can become more careful with trust. You can refuse behavior you once tolerated. You can stop returning to places that diminish you. Those are living choices. Those choices matter. The past does not need to apologize before you make them. This is also where pride becomes easier to release. Pride often says, "I cannot believe they did that to me." Listen to the sentence carefully. Sometimes the deepest pain is not only that someone acted badly, it is that their behavior violated the story you believed life owed you. I gave so much. They should have treated me better. I was loyal. They should have been loyal. I was honest. They should have been honest. Those expectations are understandable. But life is not a perfect exchange. Good behavior does not purchase immunity from pain. Loyalty does not guarantee loyalty. Kindness does not guarantee kindness. Virtue is not a contract with the universe. The Stoics knew this. You act well because acting well is part of your character, not because it guarantees everyone else will do the same. That is a difficult kind of freedom. You stop saying, "I was good, so life owed me fairness." Instead, you say, "I will remain guided by my values even when others are not." That is much stronger, because now your goodness is not dependent on reward. Your peace is not dependent on fairness. Your character is not dependent on how someone treated you. This does not make injustice smaller. It makes your inner life larger than the injustice, and that is the goal. Tonight, if you feel the old protest returning, notice the language. It should not have happened. Then answer gently, "Yes, and it did." That is not cruelty. That is reality. Then ask, "What does this moment require from me now?" Maybe the answer is rest. Maybe the answer is release. Maybe the answer is nothing. Sometimes nothing is the wisest response, because not every old wound needs another meeting. Not every unfair event needs another argument. Not every wrong requires you to keep presenting evidence to the universe. There comes a point where continuing the protest becomes another way of giving the event control. It still gets your attention. It still changes your mood. It still enters your night. It still decides what peace is allowed. That is too much authority for something that already happened. Stoic acceptance removes that authority. It says, you happened, you mattered, you were wrong, and you do not control this moment. That is powerful. You do not have to call the past fair. You only have to stop demanding that it become fair before you move on. You do not have to forgive immediately. You do not have to understand everything. You do not have to feel grateful for the lesson. You only have to stop making peace conditional on a different history. Because history will not change. But your relationship to it can. And eventually the mind becomes tired of arguing with what no longer argues back. You see the event clearly. You name it accurately. You keep the wisdom. And then you let reality remain what it is. Not because it deserved your acceptance, because you deserve your peace. And once you stop arguing with reality, another habit becomes easier to notice. The mind begins writing speeches, perfect speeches. The kind where you finally say everything you should have said. You explain exactly how they hurt you. You describe every contradiction. You make every point clearly. You expose every lie. You say the sentence that leaves them silent. And in your mind, this time they finally understand. They finally see you. They finally feel what you felt. They finally have no answer. For a moment, that imaginary conversation can feel satisfying, but then it ends, and nothing has changed. This is one of the strangest ways pain keeps itself alive. You are no longer only remembering the past. You are preparing for a conversation that may never happen. You rehearse it in the shower. You rehearse it while driving. You rehearse it before sleep. Sometimes you even change the speech depending on what you think they might say back. If they deny it, you have an answer. If they blame you, you have another answer. If they apologize, you know what you will say. If they act cold, you know how you will respond. The mind prepares for every version, and yet the person is not there. That is the trap. You are spending real emotional energy on an unreal conversation. The Stoics would ask you to look closely at what you are trying to achieve. Do you want to express yourself? Or do you want to control how they receive what you express? Those are very different things. Expression belongs partly to you. Understanding belongs to them. You can speak clearly. You cannot force someone to hear clearly. You can tell the truth. You cannot force someone to value the truth. You can explain your pain. You cannot command another person to feel the correct amount of remorse. And this is where many imaginary speeches become endless, because the real goal is not simply to speak. The real goal is to produce a reaction. You want their face to change. You want their excuses to disappear. You want their confidence to collapse. You want them to finally say, I understand now. And because you cannot guarantee that in real life, the mind creates the scene internally. There, you control everything. You control the words. You control the timing. You control their silence. You even control their regret. But control inside imagination can become another form of attachment, because every rehearsal keeps them important. You may think you are preparing to release them, but sometimes you are keeping them at the center of your inner world. This is why Stoicism redirects the purpose of speech. Instead of asking, what could I say that would make them understand? Ask, what does this situation teach me about what I stand for? That changes the entire direction. Now the speech is no longer for them. It is for you. You may discover that beneath all the sentences you wanted to say are a few clear principles. I will not stay where I am, repeatedly disrespected. I will not beg for honesty. I will not argue for my worth. I will pay attention when actions and words do not match. I will speak sooner when something violates my values. Those principles are more useful than any perfect speech, because a speech tries to change one person. A principle changes how you live. That is a much better use of pain. You do not need the person who hurt you to understand your principles before those principles become valid. You can live them now. This is one of the great Stoic shifts, from performance to character, from proving to practicing, from explaining yourself to becoming clear within yourself. There is freedom in that, because sometimes the reason you keep rehearsing is that you never felt heard. Perhaps you tried to explain before and they dismissed you. Perhaps they interrupted. Perhaps they mocked you. Perhaps they twisted your words. Perhaps they walked away. And now your mind wants another chance. That makes sense. But an internal speech cannot force a past person to become a better listener. What it can do is reveal what still needs to be acknowledged by you. Maybe you need to admit, "That hurt me more than I wanted to admit." Maybe you need to say, "I was treated badly." Maybe you need to accept, "I stayed too long because I hoped things would change." Maybe you need to say, "I deserved more honesty than I received." These statements do not require an audience. They require honesty. That is the difference. A lot of mental rehearsal is really unspoken truth looking for somewhere to go. Give it somewhere wiser to go. Turn it into a boundary. Turn it into a lesson. Turn it into a decision. Turn it into a standard. Do not keep turning it into another imaginary argument, because arguments have opponents. Principles do not. A principle can stand quietly. It does not need applause. It does not need agreement. It does not need the other person to admit defeat. That is why it is stronger. There is also another danger in rehearsing the perfect speech. It creates the illusion that there was one perfect combination of words that could have changed everything. That if only you had been calmer, sharper, clearer, stronger, they would have finally understood. But sometimes people understand and still do not change. Sometimes they know exactly what they did. Sometimes they hear you perfectly and choose themselves anyway. Sometimes no speech is powerful enough to create character in someone who refuses to practice it. That truth can be painful, but it can also stop you from blaming yourself for not finding the magical sentence. There may have been no magical sentence. There may have been only reality, and reality may have been telling you something through their behavior that words could never fix. Stoicism teaches you to pay attention to conduct. A person's response to truth tells you something. A person's response to your boundary tells you something. A person's refusal to listen tells you something. You do not always need another conversation. Sometimes the conversation has already happened through action, and once you see that, the need to rehearse begins to weaken. Tonight, if the speech starts again, notice it. You will feel the mind-building momentum. You will hear yourself forming sentences. Pause before the first imaginary reply comes back. Then ask, what am I really trying to make them understand? Find the answer. Maybe it is, "You hurt me." Then tell yourself the truth. "I know." Maybe it is, "I deserved better." Answer yourself. "Yes." Maybe it is, "You had no right to treat me that way." Say, "I no longer accept that treatment." Feel what just happened. The energy moved. It stopped traveling toward them. It returned to you. That is the Stoic move. You stop trying to control their mind and begin clarifying your own. You stop preparing arguments and begin choosing standards. You stop needing the last word because your life becomes the last word. That is much more powerful. Perhaps the strongest response to what they did is not a brilliant speech. Perhaps it is a peaceful life that no longer revolves around them, a stronger boundary, a calmer mind, better choices. deeper self-respect. Those things say more than an imaginary confrontation ever could, and there is something else worth remembering. Not every truth needs to be delivered to the person who made you learn it. Some truths are for your own life. Some lessons are meant to remain private. Some realizations become valuable precisely because you stop trying to hand them back to the person who caused them. You take the lesson, you leave the argument, that is enough. You may never get the moment where they sit quietly and finally understand everything. You may never see regret cross their face. You may never hear the sentence you wanted, but you can still become clear. You can still become steady. You can still decide what you will and will not carry forward. And when the mind begins rehearsing again tonight, you can say something simple. I do not need to win this conversation. Then perhaps something even stronger. I already know what I stand for. That is where the speech ends. Not because you ran out of words, because you no longer need an audience. And once you stop rehearsing for someone who may never listen, something deeper becomes possible. You begin to realize that closure was never supposed to be a performance. It was supposed to become a decision. And once you stop rehearsing the speech they may never hear, you begin to understand something even deeper. Closure may have very little to do with what they say next. It may have everything to do with what you decide next. Because perhaps the final question is not, will they ever understand what they did? Perhaps the final question is, what will I refuse to let this turn me into? That is where real closure begins. Someone betrayed you. You could spend years waiting for them to explain it, regret it, or suffer for it, or you could make a different decision. Their betrayal will not teach me to become cruel. Someone rejected you. You could let that rejection make you desperate for approval. Or you could decide, their decision will not make me beg for worth. Someone humiliated you. You could carry their words like a permanent judgment. Or you could say, what they said will not become the voice I use against myself. That is a different kind of ending, a stronger one. Because now closure is no longer something another person gives you. It becomes something you practice through character. The Stoics understood that what happens to you is not the final part of the story. What matters deeply is what you become in response. This is not about pretending pain has no effect. Of course it has an effect. Betrayal changes you. Loss changes you. Disappointment changes you. But change does not have to mean corruption. That is the key. Pain can make you wiser without making you bitter. Rejection can make you more grounded without making you desperate. Humiliation can make you stronger without making you ashamed of yourself. This is where your power returns. You cannot choose what another person did, but you can choose what lesson gets to remain. That is a moral decision, and moral decisions are different from emotional reactions. An emotional reaction says, I will never trust again. A moral decision says, I will trust more carefully. An emotional reaction says, I will never love anyone that deeply again. A moral decision says, I will love without abandoning my judgment. An emotional reaction says, people are terrible. A moral decision says, some people act badly, and I will not become like them. Feel the difference. One reaction gives the wound authority, the other gives you authority. This is one of the most powerful Stoic ideas. The person who harmed you does not get to decide your character unless you hand that decision over. And sometimes we hand it over without realizing it. Someone lies to us, and we become suspicious of everyone. Someone abandons us, and we become afraid to need anyone. Someone uses our kindness, and we become ashamed of being kind. Someone mocks our vulnerability, and we close completely. Now their behavior is still changing us. Even after they are gone, That is why closure is not only about no longer thinking about them, it is about no longer letting their behavior continue shaping your inner life. This is a much deeper freedom. Ask yourself tonight, what did their behavior try to teach me that I do not want to learn? Maybe betrayal tried to teach you that trust is foolish. Do you want to keep that lesson? Maybe rejection tried to teach you that you must earn love by becoming more pleasing. Do you want to keep that? Maybe humiliation tried to teach you that your value depends on how another person sees you. Do you want that belief inside you? This is where you become selective. Pain gives many lessons. Not all of them are wise. Some are defensive. Some are fearful. Some are born from shock. You do not have to keep every conclusion pain gave you. You can choose. You can say, I learned to notice inconsistency. Keep that. I learned to speak sooner. Keep that. I learned that apology without change is not enough. Keep that. I learned never to trust anyone again. No, that one can go. I learned that I am difficult to love. No, that one can go too. This is moral editing. You keep the wisdom. You remove the poison. That is closure. And this is why waiting for someone else to create closure can become so exhausting. They may apologize, but what if you have already become bitter? They may explain. But what if you have already built your identity around being betrayed? They may regret it. But what if you have already spent years doubting your worth? Their words cannot repair everything automatically, because the deepest work was never entirely theirs. It was always partly yours. You must decide what the event means going forward, not what it meant then, what it means now. Perhaps it means you will become more careful. Perhaps it means you will become more honest with yourself. Perhaps it means you will stop ignoring small acts of disrespect. Perhaps it means you will no longer chase people who continually make you question your place in their life. These are useful meanings. They strengthen character. Stoicism always returns to character, not reputation, not revenge, not being understood. Character. Who are you choosing to become now? That question is much more important than whether the person who hurt you eventually becomes who you wanted them to be. They may never change. You still can, and not changing into something worse is itself a form of victory. Think about that. If someone treated you with dishonesty and you still choose honesty, they did not defeat your character. If someone treated you without compassion and you remain capable of compassion, they did not take that from you. If someone rejected you and you still refuse to measure your worth through rejection, they did not define you. If someone humiliated you and you still carry yourself with dignity, their words failed to become your identity. This is Stoic strength, quiet strength. It does not need to announce itself. It does not need the other person to see it. It does not need revenge. It simply refuses to surrender the inner life. There is also something peaceful about deciding what will no longer change in you, because pain often creates movement in every direction. One day you feel angry, another day you feel worthless, another day you want revenge, another day you miss them. Another day you want answers. The mind is pulled everywhere, but a principle creates stillness. This will not make me cruel. That is stable. This will not make me beg. Stable. This will not make me hate myself. Stable. This will not make me abandon my values. Stable. Now you are no longer waiting for emotion to settle before you know who you are. You have decided. That is powerful. And this does not mean you will never feel angry again. You may. It does not mean you will never feel sadness. You will. It does not mean the memory will disappear. It may still visit. But beneath all of that, there is a decision, a foundation, and foundations do not need to move every time the weather changes. That is what Stoic principles offer, something solid beneath emotion. Tonight, think about the person who hurt you and ask a different question. Not, why did they do it? Not, will they regret it? Not, will they ever apologize? Ask, what will I refuse to become because of this? Let the answer be simple. Perhaps, I will not become cruel. I will not become desperate. I will not become ashamed. I will not become obsessed with proving my worth. I will not become someone who hurts others just because I was hurt. Then ask one more question. What will I choose to become instead? More discerning, more patient, more self-respecting, more honest, more peaceful, more careful with where you place your trust. This is where the event begins losing control. Because now it is no longer deciding your direction. You are. And perhaps that is the closure you were searching for all along. Not an apology, not an explanation, not a confession. A decision. A quiet decision that says, what you did may be part of my history, but it will not become the author of my character. That is where the ending becomes yours. And once you decide what their behavior will no longer change in you, another kind of freedom becomes possible. You begin to outgrow the version of yourself that still wanted them to regret losing you. That version of you may have been very patient. It may have survived for a long time. It may have whispered, one day they will see. One day they will realize what they lost. One day they will watch you become stronger. One day they will regret how they treated you. One day they will wish they had chosen differently. And for a while that hope can feel powerful. It can help you get out of bed. It can push you to work harder. It can make you want to improve your life. But there is a hidden cost. If your future is built around making them regret the past, then they are still standing at the center of your future. That is not freedom. It is another form of connection. The Stoics would ask you to look carefully at motivation. Why do you want to become stronger? Why do you want to succeed? Why do you want to heal? Why do you want to look happier, calmer, more successful, more complete? Is it because those things are good for your life? Or because you still want someone from the past to notice? That question matters. Because revenge does not always look like revenge. Sometimes revenge looks like ambition. Sometimes it looks like transformation. Sometimes it looks like a perfect life built for an invisible audience. You tell yourself, I will show them, and the sentence feels strong, but notice who still has power inside it. Them. Your success is still aimed in their direction. Your growth is still waiting for their reaction. Your peace is still performing. That is not the Stoic goal. Stoic freedom is quieter. It says, I will grow even if they never see it. That changes everything. Because maybe they never will see it. Maybe they will never check your life. Maybe they will never ask about you. Maybe they will hear that you are doing well and feel nothing. Maybe they will see you happy and still believe they did nothing wrong. What then? Would your growth become less valuable? Of course not. But if part of you says yes, then your life is still tied to their recognition. This is why vindication can become such a subtle trap. You want the ending where the truth becomes obvious. You want other people to understand that you were right. You want the person who hurt you to realize that you were not the problem. You want life itself to reveal your value. But Stoicism does not ask you to live for a future verdict. It asks you to live according to what is good now. That is harder, because it removes the audience. No applause, no dramatic regret. No moment where the person who rejected you returns and says, I made a terrible mistake. No scene where everyone finally sees how strong you became. Just you, your choices, your character, your life, and that is enough. There is something very honest about realizing that even revenge fantasies are forms of attachment. You may say, "I never want to see them again," but then spend hours imagining the day they see you thriving. You may say, "I do not care what they think," but still want them to feel jealous. You may say, "I am over it," but still hope they hear about your success. That does not make you weak. It means part of you is still asking the past for recognition, and that part can be released. Not shamed, released, because it probably appeared for a reason. Maybe you felt unseen. Maybe you were treated as if you were easy to replace. Maybe they made you feel small. Maybe they walked away believing they had lost nothing. So your mind created a future where the balance changes. In that future, you become everything they underestimated. They see it, they regret it, and finally, you feel restored. But restoration built on another person's reaction is fragile. What if they never react? What if they do not regret it? What if they never understand what you became? You cannot build a peaceful future on that uncertainty. The Stoic alternative is much stronger. Let your life become valuable to you, not as evidence, not as revenge, not as proof, as life. Your health matters because you are living in your body. Your peace matters because you are living in your mind. Your work matters because it expresses your effort. Your relationships matter because they are happening now. Your growth matters because it changes your character. None of that needs to be witnessed by the person who hurt you. This is where you begin to outgrow the old version of yourself. You stop saying, "I hope they regret it," and begin saying, "I hope I eventually stop needing them to." That is a deeper goal, because regret still keeps you connected. If you need them to regret losing you, then their emotional state still matters too much. Their sadness would satisfy you. Their indifference would disturb you. Their return would validate you. Their silence would challenge you. You are still responsive to them. Freedom means becoming less responsive. Not numb, not cold, simply less organized around their existence. This is one of the most powerful Stoic ideas. Your life should be guided by your values, not by another person's reaction. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that praise and blame belong to other minds. So does regret. You cannot command it. And even if you could, what would you do with it? Suppose they came back tomorrow. Suppose they said everything you once wanted to hear. "I was wrong. I lost someone good. I regret what I did." For a moment, you might feel satisfaction. But then what? The years still happened. The betrayal still happened. The version of you who suffered still suffered. Their regret cannot travel backward and repair the past. So perhaps the thing you were waiting for was never as powerful as you thought. That realization is freeing, because now you can stop designing your future around obtaining it. You can also stop turning self-improvement into revenge. This matters more than people realize. You may start exercising because you want them to see what they lost. You may chase money because you want them to regret doubting you. You may post happiness because you want them to believe you have moved on. But if they are still the imagined audience, then the past is still directing the performance. Ask yourself, if they could never know about this, would I still want it? Would you still want the stronger body? Would you still want the peaceful home? Would you still want the successful career? Would you still want the healthier relationship? Would you still want the calmer mind? If the answer is yes, then it belongs to you. That is powerful. That is clean motivation. But if the answer is no, then perhaps the goal needs to be examined. You deserve dreams that do not require an enemy. You deserve progress that does not need a witness. You deserve happiness that does not have to be seen by someone who once refused to value you. That is a different kind of success. a quieter kind, and often a more lasting one. There is also something else to release, the fantasy of becoming untouchable. Sometimes after being hurt you think, I will become so strong that nobody can ever do this to me again. That sounds like growth. But sometimes it is fear wearing armor. Real strength is not becoming impossible to hurt. That is impossible. Real strength is knowing that if pain comes again, you will not lose yourself inside it. You do not need to become unreachable. You need to become rooted. That is Stoic strength. You can care without surrendering yourself. You can trust without abandoning judgment. You can love without handing over your identity. You can succeed without making success a weapon. And you can heal without using healing as a message to the person who hurt you. That is when your future becomes yours again. Tonight, if the mind creates the scene where they finally regret everything, notice it. Do not criticize yourself. Just ask, why do I still need them in this picture? Then remove them. Keep the future. Remove the audience. See yourself peaceful. But they do not have to see it. See yourself successful. But they do not have to know. See yourself loved. But they do not have to feel jealous. See yourself sleeping calmly. But they do not have to regret anything. Feel how much quieter that future becomes. Now the life is not a message. It is simply yours. That is the shift. You stop building a life that says, look what you lost, and begin building one that says nothing to them at all. Because eventually, the strongest sign that you have moved on is not that they regret losing you. It is that their regret has become irrelevant. You do not need them to look back. You no longer live facing backward. And when the future stops being organized around proving anything to the person who hurt you, the future finally becomes what it was supposed to be, a place you are moving toward. Not a stage where the past comes to watch. And once your future no longer needs to prove anything to the person who hurt you, another danger becomes easier to see. One person can leave your life, but their behavior can stay behind as a lens through which you begin judging everyone else. That is how one betrayal becomes larger than itself. One person lies to you, and suddenly honesty feels suspicious. One person abandons you, and suddenly closeness feels unsafe. One person uses your kindness, and suddenly generosity feels foolish. One person breaks your trust, and suddenly everyone who comes after them must answer for what they did. This is how pain becomes a philosophy. And that is too much power to give one person. The Stoics would not tell you to forget the lesson. They would tell you to make the lesson precise. There is a difference. Pain says, people cannot be trusted. Wisdom says, trust should be earned through consistent behavior. Pain says, everyone eventually leaves. Wisdom says, some people leave, and I can survive that without assuming everyone will. Pain says, kindness makes you weak. Wisdom says, kindness needs boundaries. Pain takes one event and turns it into a universal law. Stoicism asks you to stop before doing that. Because one person's character is not human nature. Their betrayal is not proof that everyone betrays. Their dishonesty is not proof that honesty is rare everywhere. Their selfishness is not proof that love is always selfish. Their failure is information about them. It may also give you information about what you ignored, tolerated, or misunderstood, but it does not give you the right conclusion about every person you have not met yet. That is where discernment matters. Discernment says, I will watch carefully. Suspicion says, I already know how this ends. Those are not the same thing. Discernment observes, suspicion predicts. Discernment pays attention to patterns. Suspicion assumes the pattern before evidence appears. Discernment protects you. Suspicion can imprison you. And after deep hurt, suspicion can feel like intelligence. You tell yourself, I am just being realistic now. But sometimes what feels like realism is actually fear that has learned better language. You are not necessarily seeing people more clearly. You may simply be seeing the old person inside new faces. That is worth noticing. Someone new takes longer to reply, and immediately the old memory wakes up. They are losing interest. Someone changes plans, and your mind says, "Here we go again." Someone makes a mistake, and you begin searching for signs of betrayal. Someone is kind to you, and instead of receiving the kindness, you wonder what they want. Now the past is interpreting the present before the present has had a chance to speak for itself. That is not fairness. And Stoicism is deeply concerned with fair judgment, not emotional judgment, not fear-based judgment, clear judgment. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to see things as they are, not as imagination adds to them. That principle becomes powerful here. What is actually happening? Not what happened before, not what this reminds you of, not what you fear it could become. What is happening now? This person cancelled once. That is the fact. Everyone eventually disappoints me is the addition. This person disagreed with you. That is the fact. They are beginning to disrespect me just like the other person did, may be the addition. This person has not replied yet. That is the fact. They are preparing to abandon me is a story. The Stoic mind learns to separate observation from prediction. That does not mean ignoring warning signs. It means refusing to invent warning signs where evidence has not yet appeared. There is a deep peace in learning to say, "I do not know yet." That sentence is difficult after betrayal, because betrayal makes uncertainty feel dangerous. You want to know immediately whether someone is safe. You want certainty. You want guarantees. You want to detect the ending before the beginning has even developed. But human relationships do not offer guarantees. There will always be uncertainty. The answer is not to become suspicious enough to eliminate it. You cannot. The answer is to become grounded enough to live with it. That is Stoic strength. Not knowing that nobody will ever hurt you, knowing that if someone does, you will remain capable of responding with wisdom. That changes everything, because now your safety does not depend entirely on predicting other people. It depends partly on trusting yourself. You trust yourself to notice patterns. You trust yourself to ask questions. You trust yourself to set limits. You trust yourself to leave when something becomes consistently harmful. That kind of self-trust is far healthier than trying to become a perfect judge of everyone before they enter your life. There is another danger in turning pain into a philosophy. You may begin rejecting good experiences before they have a chance to exist. Someone offers genuine care, but you hold back because the last person used care as manipulation. Someone offers loyalty, but you search for the hidden motive. Someone tries to know you deeply, but you remain distant because intimacy once became painful. Now the person who hurt you is shaping relationships they will never even know about. Think about that. They are no longer present, yet their behavior is deciding how much love you allow, how much trust you offer, how open you become, how quickly you retreat. That means their worst moment is still influencing people who did nothing to deserve it. This is where healing becomes an act of fairness. Not only fairness toward yourself, fairness toward the future. New people should not automatically inherit old guilt. They should be evaluated by their own behavior. That is reasonable, that is balanced, that is Stoic. You do not have to give everyone full trust immediately. That would not be wisdom. Trust can grow slowly. It can be tested by time. It can increase through consistency. But suspicion should also require evidence. That balance matters. You can say, I am open but observant. That is very different from saying, I am closed until someone proves they are incapable of hurting me. No one can prove that. Human beings are imperfect. Even good people disappoint. Even trustworthy people make mistakes. So your goal cannot be finding people who will never fail. Your goal is learning to distinguish ordinary human imperfection from patterns that destroy trust. That requires calm judgment. A person forgetting something once is not the same as repeated disregard. A person needing space is not automatically abandonment. A disagreement is not betrayal. A mistake is not always manipulation. You become stronger when you stop treating every discomfort as evidence that history is repeating. That does not mean ignoring your instincts. It means refining them. Pain creates loud instincts. Wisdom creates accurate ones. Loud instincts react quickly. Accurate ones observe patiently. That is the kind of discernment Stoicism encourages. And this is where you begin keeping the lesson without keeping the fear. Perhaps the lesson from your past is, watch whether words match actions. Keep that. Perhaps the lesson is, do not ignore repeated disrespect. Keep that. Perhaps the lesson is, ask questions when something feels inconsistent. Keep that. But never trust anyone again is not a lesson. It is a wound speaking. People only care about themselves is not wisdom. It is pain trying to protect itself through certainty. And pain loves certainty because uncertainty once hurt. But certainty about all human beings is impossible, so release the false certainty. Let each person reveal themselves. That is enough. You do not have to decide in advance. This is another form of freedom. You stop making the future pay for the past. You stop looking for the old face inside every new one. You stop turning one person's failure into a permanent theory about love, trust, friendship, or human character. Because if you do that, the person who hurt you becomes your teacher in the worst possible way. They teach you to close. They teach you to doubt. They teach you to expect betrayal. They teach you to see danger everywhere. You do not have to accept those lessons. You can choose better ones. You can say, what happened taught me to be discerning, not cynical. That is a powerful sentence. Cynicism often sounds wise because it expects disappointment. But expecting disappointment is not the same as understanding people. Sometimes cynicism is simply hope that became embarrassed by pain. Stoicism offers something better than cynicism: realism. Realism says people are capable of selfishness and generosity, deception and honesty, weakness and courage. You do not need to idealize human beings. You also do not need to condemn them all. You observe. You choose carefully. You respond to what is actually shown. That is enough. Tonight, ask yourself whether one person has become the spokesperson for everyone in your mind. When someone new enters your life, whose behavior are you really evaluating? Theirs or the old person's? That question can reveal a lot. And if you notice the past speaking too loudly, remind yourself, this is a different person. This is a different moment. I will judge what is here, not what happened before. That does not erase experience. It puts experience in its proper place, behind you as wisdom, not in front of you as a filter, because the goal was never to become so guarded that no one could ever hurt you again. The goal is to become wise enough that someone else's worst behavior never gets to define what you believe about everyone who comes after them. One person hurt you. They do not get to interpret humanity for the rest of your life, and this is where discernment can quietly turn into something heavier. Once you have been hurt badly enough, the mind may decide that remembering everything is the only way to make sure it never happens again. So it watches, it reviews, it compares, it studies every detail, and it calls this protection. You replay the first strange comment because maybe there was a warning hidden inside it. You revisit the first broken promise because perhaps that was the moment you should have known. You examine their tone, their habits, the things they avoided, the words they used, the changes you noticed too late. The mind tells you, if I understand every detail, nobody will ever fool me like that again. At first, this can feel wise. And some reflection is wise. Pain should teach you something. If you were manipulated, learning the pattern matters. If you ignored repeated dishonesty, recognizing it matters. If you kept explaining away behavior that clearly violated your values, understanding why you did that can help you choose differently. That is reflection. But reflection has an ending. Rumination does not. That is the difference you must learn to recognize. Useful reflection asks a question, finds a lesson, and changes behavior. Rumination asks the same question after the lesson has already been found. Useful reflection says, next time I will pay attention when words repeatedly contradict actions. Rumination says, let me go through every conversation again in case there is something else I missed. Useful reflection prepares you. Rumination keeps you on guard, and living on guard can eventually become its own form of suffering. Because once the mind becomes convinced that enough analysis can prevent all future pain, it receives an impossible job. It must predict every betrayal, detect every lie, understand every hidden motive, notice every change, catch every danger early, never be surprised again. That sounds like protection, but it is really a demand for perfect foresight, and no human being possesses that. The Stoics understood that safety does not come from controlling every possible event. It comes from learning what belongs to your control and becoming steady enough to face what does not. That distinction matters here. You can control whether you pay attention. You cannot control whether every person tells you the truth. You can control whether you enforce your boundaries. You cannot guarantee that nobody will ever test them. You can choose whom you trust gradually. You cannot know everything hidden inside another person. You can respond wisely when evidence appears. You cannot remove uncertainty from human relationships. Rumination tries to erase that uncertainty. Stoicism teaches you how to live without needing to. That is a much stronger kind of protection, because hyperanalysis eventually changes the question from "what can I learn?" to "what danger have I not detected yet?" And once that happens, the mind begins searching constantly. It becomes a guard who never sleeps. Someone speaks differently one day. The mind notices. Someone takes longer to reply. The mind investigates. Someone becomes quiet. The mind prepares for abandonment. Someone seems especially kind. The mind wonders what they want. Now you are no longer simply observing life. You are scanning it. That can feel intelligent because scanning sometimes finds real problems. But if you scan long enough, almost anything can begin to look suspicious. A pause becomes evidence. A mistake becomes a pattern. A mood becomes a warning. An ordinary disagreement becomes the beginning of betrayal. Fear is very creative when it is given enough details. And this is why constant vigilance does not necessarily produce better judgment. Sometimes it produces more interpretations. That is not the same thing. The Stoic mind aims for clear perception. What do I actually know? That question interrupts fear, not "what could this mean?" Anything could mean many things. Ask instead, "what has actually happened?" That keeps you grounded. Suppose someone takes several hours to answer you. The fact is simple. They have not answered yet. Hyperanalysis immediately begins writing possibilities. They are pulling away. They have found someone else. They are deliberately ignoring me. They are becoming like the person who hurt me before. Notice how quickly one fact becomes an entire future. This is exactly what rumination does. It tries to protect you by completing missing information with fearful possibilities. But possibilities are endless. If you treat each possibility as a threat that requires mental preparation, you will never rest. There is always another terrible thing that could happen, another betrayal that could be hidden, another person who could disappoint you, another ending you could fail to predict. Stoicism does not ask you to prepare for every possible detail. It asks you to prepare your character. That is very different. Instead of saying, I must know exactly what will happen, you say, whatever happens, I will respond according to my principles. That creates real stability. Maybe someone will disappoint you. You will respond. Maybe someone will lie. You will examine the evidence and act. Maybe a relationship will change. You will deal with what becomes real. You do not need to experience every possible future tonight in order to survive tomorrow. That is a sentence worth remembering. You do not need to suffer in advance. Seneca warned against this kind of mental suffering. Human beings often suffer not only from what actually happens, but from the futures they construct before anything has occurred. And when you have been hurt before, those constructed futures can become especially convincing. The mind says, "Last time I did not worry enough." But that is rarely the truth. Worry did not fail to protect you, because there was not enough of it. Worry is simply not the same thing as wisdom. Wisdom acts when action is available. Worry keeps acting when no action exists. That is how you can tell the difference. Ask yourself, is there something I need to do? If yes, do it. Have the conversation. Set the boundary. Observe the pattern. Ask the question. Slow down your trust. Make the decision. But if there is nothing to do, continuing to analyze is not preparation anymore. It is mental guarding. And a guard who never leaves the gate eventually forgets how to live inside the house. You were not meant to spend your whole life watching for intruders. You were meant to live. That means risk will remain. This can be difficult to accept, because after betrayal, you may think the goal of healing is to become impossible to deceive again. It is not. You can become wiser. You can become more observant. You can reduce unnecessary risks. But you will never become all-knowing, and you do not need to. Your strength is not that nobody will ever surprise you again. Your strength is that surprise no longer has the power to destroy your relationship with yourself. That is deeper protection. You trust your ability to respond. You know that if someone shows repeated dishonesty, you can step back. If someone continually crosses a boundary, you can act. If someone reveals themselves to be unsafe, you do not have to keep making excuses. You are not dependent on seeing everything at the beginning. You can respond as information arrives. That takes enormous pressure off the mind. You no longer need to solve people in advance. Let them reveal themselves. Time is very good at revealing patterns. You do not need to force the process through constant analysis. Consistency tells you something. Repeated behavior tells you something. How a person responds when you say no tells you something. How they handle responsibility tells you something. How their actions compare with their promises tells you something. You can observe those things without turning every interaction into an investigation. That is the Stoic balance. Awareness without obsession, attention without fear, preparation without trying to control the unknowable. And there is another question worth asking tonight. How many times have I already studied this memory? Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds, maybe thousands. Has the 100th review taught you something the 10th did not? If not, then perhaps the mind is no longer learning. It is rehearsing fear. That realization can be freeing. You have permission to declare the lesson complete. You can say, I understand enough. Not everything. Enough. Enough to make wiser decisions. Enough to recognize what matters. Enough to know what you will do differently. You do not need complete knowledge before you rest. Tonight, when the mind tries to open the old file again, ask one question. Is there new information here? If the answer is no, close it. Not angrily. Simply recognize what is happening. This is not learning anymore. Then return to the present. Your bed, your breathing, the quiet around you. Nothing is asking for a decision right now. Nothing needs to be investigated. You do not have to stand watch. The future will arrive when it arrives. And when it does, you will meet what is actually there. That is enough. You can prepare without predicting. You can become wise without becoming watchful every second. You can learn from betrayal without building your entire life around preventing another one. Because the goal was never to become so alert that pain could never find you. The goal is to become so grounded that fear no longer has to guard you through the night. And once you stop treating rumination as protection, another painful truth becomes easier to see. Sometimes the mind is not only trying to prevent future pain, it is trying to collect a debt from the past. It wants something back. The years, the trust, the dignity, the innocence, the relationship as it once was, the version of you that existed before everything changed. And this is where memory becomes a bargain the past can never honor. You may think, I gave them 5 years of my life. Then underneath that thought comes another one. I want those years back. You may think, they destroyed my trust. And underneath it, I want to feel exactly the way I did before. You may think, they embarrassed me. And somewhere inside, I want my dignity restored as if that moment never happened. These wishes are understandable, but they are impossible, and impossible demands create endless suffering. The Stoics understood that some losses cannot be reversed, not because they are unimportant, but because time only moves in one direction. That is the part the mind hates. It wants repayment in the exact form of the loss. If time was taken, it wants time returned. If trust was broken, it wants untouched trust back. If a relationship was damaged, it wants the original relationship restored. If innocence was lost, it wants to become the person who never learned the painful truth. But life rarely repays in the same currency. Sometimes it does not repay at all. And when you keep demanding that it must, the past gains another form of control. You are no longer only hurt by what happened. You are hurt by what cannot be returned. That second pain can become larger than the first. Consider lost time. Perhaps you stayed in a relationship far longer than you now wish you had. 5 years? 10 years? Maybe more. The mind looks backward and says, those years were stolen. And perhaps some of them were deeply painful. But if you spend the next 5 years grieving the first 5, what happens? The past takes 10. Not because it physically reached forward, because your attention kept paying it. That is the danger. You cannot recover yesterday by sacrificing today. That is one of the clearest Stoic lessons. The past cannot be made richer by making the present poorer. So when the mind says, I want my time back, answer differently. My time is here. Now, this hour, this evening, this breath. This is the only form in which time can be returned to you. Not backward, forward. You reclaim lost time by no longer giving away the time that remains. That is far more powerful than replaying what was taken. The same is true of dignity. Perhaps someone humiliated you. Maybe they exposed something private, mocked you, rejected you publicly, reduced you in front of people whose opinions mattered. And the mind wants to erase the scene. It wants everyone to forget. It wants the person to admit they were wrong. It wants to return to the moment before it happened. But dignity is not something that exists only when nobody has ever humiliated you. Dignity is how you carry yourself after humiliation has occurred. That is an important distinction. Someone can embarrass you without permanently owning your dignity. Your dignity lives in your conduct now, in how you speak, in what you tolerate, in whether you abandon your principles because someone once tried to make you feel small. The past cannot return your dignity because, in the deepest Stoic sense, it was never theirs to permanently take. They may have affected your reputation, they may have wounded your pride, they may have caused shame, but character remains yours to rebuild and express. And sometimes what you rebuild is stronger because it no longer depends on everyone seeing you correctly. That is growth the past cannot take back. Trust creates another impossible bargain. After betrayal, the mind often wants the old kind of trust again. Effortless trust. Untouched trust. The kind you had before you learned that someone could look you in the eyes and still deceive you. You may miss that version of yourself. You may think, I want to trust like I used to. But perhaps that is not what healing is. Maybe healing does not return you to innocence. Maybe it moves you toward discernment. There is a difference. Innocence says, I never knew this could happen. Wisdom says, I know it can happen, and I can still live. That is not a lesser form of trust. It may actually be stronger. Because now trust is not based on ignorance of risk. It is based on willingness to live despite risk. You can become open again without becoming blind. You can care again without pretending betrayal is impossible. You can trust while also paying attention. You are not required to become exactly who you were before. This is another place where the demand for repayment becomes painful. You want your old self back. But perhaps your old self is not the destination. Perhaps there is a wiser self ahead, one who carries the lesson without living inside the wound. That is different from being damaged forever. It means experience has changed you, and change is not always loss. Sometimes the mind also bargains with relationships. If only we could return to how things were, before the lie, before the betrayal, before the truth came out, before the argument changed everything. You may spend nights visiting the good memories and trying to mentally rebuild the old relationship, but there is something important to remember. Once you know what you know, you cannot unknow it. The old relationship existed partly because certain truths had not yet been revealed. That does not mean every good memory was fake. It means the past version of the relationship belonged to a different level of knowledge. You cannot return to it exactly, and trying to may keep you from deciding what is possible now. Maybe the relationship can become something new. Maybe it cannot continue. Maybe trust can be rebuilt slowly. Maybe the wisest choice is distance. Those are present questions. Can I get the old relationship back? Is usually a past question. Stoicism teaches you to stop asking reality to reproduce what no longer exists. That is not hopelessness. It is clarity. Because when you stop demanding the old thing, you finally become available for the new thing, a new relationship, a new standard, a new peace, a new understanding of yourself, a new way of living. But as long as both hands are reaching backward, they cannot receive much from what is ahead. This is why the idea of repayment must be examined carefully. Maybe you think the person who hurt you owes you an apology. Perhaps morally they do. Maybe they owe you money. Then practical action may be appropriate. Maybe they owe you an explanation. Perhaps they should give one. But even when someone truly owes something, you must separate what can realistically be recovered from what cannot. This is very Stoic. Act where action is possible. Release the demand where action is impossible. If money can be recovered, pursue the proper path. If a boundary must be enforced, enforce it. If a conversation is useful, have it. But you cannot invoice someone for your lost innocence. You cannot collect interest on lost sleep. You cannot make them return the exact person you were before the wound. Some debts cannot be collected externally, and waiting for them to be paid can become another debt you charge yourself. Every month of resentment costs attention. Every night of bargaining costs rest. Every fantasy of reversal costs presence. At some point you must ask, how much more am I willing to pay for what they took? That question can wake something up inside you, because perhaps the original cost was already too high. Do not increase it voluntarily. This does not mean saying it does not matter. It means saying it has taken enough. That is a powerful boundary with the past. It has taken enough. Enough nights, enough attention, enough imagined conversations, enough comparison between what is and what should have been. Enough bargaining. You cannot change the original price, but you can stop paying additional fees, and there is something deeply peaceful about that decision. The Stoics often return to the idea that what has happened belongs to fate, nature, the order of events already completed. Your moral task begins with what stands before you now, not because yesterday is meaningless, because yesterday is unavailable for action. That is the difference. Tonight, if the mind says, I want back what they took, do not silence it harshly. Listen, what are you asking for? Time, trust, dignity, innocence, love. Then ask, can the past literally give this back? If the answer is no, ask a better question. What can I build now that answers this loss? If you lost time, protect your time now. If you lost trust, build self-trust and let others earn theirs slowly. If you lost dignity, live with dignity tonight. If you lost a relationship, stop losing yourself along with it. If you lost innocence, turn experience into discernment. This is how you stop bargaining with memory. You stop demanding repayment from an event that has no hands. And perhaps this is the strangest truth of all. Sometimes the thing you want returned cannot come back because you are no longer meant to return either. You are meant to move forward, not empty-handed. You carry wisdom. You carry boundaries. You carry a clearer understanding of what matters. But you do not need to carry the unpaid bill. The past may never give back what it took, so stop standing at its door, waiting to be reimbursed. Take what remains, your attention, your character, your present, your future, and protect those instead. Because the moment you stop demanding payment from yesterday is often the moment today stops being held as collateral. And once you stop asking the past to repay what it cannot return, you begin to notice something happening much closer to home. Your mind may know the event is over, but your body can still react as if it is happening again. That is why nighttime can feel so intense. The room is quiet. Nothing is happening. No one is arguing with you. No one is betraying you in this moment. No one is standing in front of you. And yet your chest tightens, your stomach turns, your breathing changes, your body becomes alert. Why? Because the mind has shown it the scene again, and the body responds to what the mind keeps presenting. This is important. Your nervous system may be asking one simple question. Am I safe now? But every time you replay the betrayal in full detail, your mind answers with an old picture of danger. It shows the face, the words, the silence. The moment you realize something was wrong, the moment your trust broke. And the body does not always care that the image is old. It reacts to what is being held in attention. That is why rumination can feel physical. You're not only thinking about the event, you are repeatedly giving your body a signal. Pay attention. Something is wrong. Stay awake. Prepare. This is where Stoic attention discipline becomes deeply practical. The Stoics understood that attention is not neutral. What you repeatedly place before the mind affects how you experience the present. So if the body is trying to settle, but the mind keeps producing scenes of betrayal, you create an inner conflict. One part of you wants rest. Another part keeps sounding the alarm. And then you wonder why sleep feels far away. The answer is not to force the body to calm down while feeding it more danger. The answer is to stop supplying the danger, not the real danger, the remembered one. That distinction matters. If something harmful is happening now, respond to it. Act. Leave. Speak. Protect yourself. But if nothing is happening now, then the body does not need another presentation of the old event. It needs evidence of the present. The bed, the room, the quiet. The fact that the door is closed. The fact that the conversation is over. The fact that you are here. Now. This is why one of the most powerful things you can do at night is return from the image to the environment. The memory says, "Look at what happened." You answer, "That was then." The body asks, "Are we in danger?" You answer with what is true now. No. This does not mean the event was harmless. It means it is not happening in this room. That sentence can become an anchor. It is not happening now. Say it slowly. The betrayal is not happening now. The rejection is not happening now. The humiliation is not happening now. The argument is not happening now. Your body needs that information, not once. Repeatedly. Because if the mind has spent months giving it the opposite message, calm may take practice. That is okay. Stoicism is not built on instant transformation. It is built on repeated discipline. You practice where you place attention. That is the work. And attention is powerful because the mind tends to deepen whatever it repeatedly visits. If you repeatedly revisit danger, danger becomes familiar. If you repeatedly return to the present, presence becomes familiar. That is why nighttime discipline matters. You do not need to solve your entire past before sleep. You need to stop turning sleep into a courtroom, a battlefield, or an investigation. The night is not asking you to solve anything. It is asking you to release effort. There is also a mistake people make when they notice the body becoming tense. They become afraid of the reaction itself. My heart is racing. Why am I still affected by this? I thought I was over it. Now the body creates alarm, and the mind adds judgment. That makes everything louder. Stoicism offers a calmer response. Observe first. My body is reacting to a remembered event. That is all. No shame, no panic, no conclusion about weakness, just observation. Then redirect. Bring attention to something that belongs to the present. The weight of the blanket, the air entering the nose, the sound of the room, the position of your hands, the fact that you are lying down, not standing inside the old scene. This is not avoidance, it is orientation. You are orienting the mind toward what is real now. That is a crucial difference. Avoidance says, "This never happened." Orientation says, "It happened, but it is not happening now." That is truth, and truth calms better than denial. The Stoic mind does not deny reality. It places each thing where it belongs. The past belongs to memory. The present belongs to attention. Confusing those two creates unnecessary suffering. Keeping them separate creates space. There is another reason repeated visualization can keep the body alert. Every replay contains prediction. Even when you are remembering the past, part of the mind is asking, "What if this happens again?" That question turns memory into preparation. The body hears danger in future tense, so one old event becomes two threats: what happened and what might happen again. This doubles the alarm. Stoic practice breaks that cycle by refusing to solve an imaginary future in the middle of the night. If tomorrow requires action, tomorrow can receive action. Tonight does not need it. This is one of the simplest forms of discipline. Do not give tomorrow's possible danger tonight's energy. You do not need to guard every future moment before it arrives. That is not protection. That is exhaustion. Your body cannot distinguish wisdom from constant vigilance if both feel like alarm. So give it a different signal. You can rest. Nothing needs to be decided now. Nothing needs to be confronted now. Nothing needs to be prevented in this minute. That is not laziness. It is correct timing. The Stoics valued right action, but right action includes knowing when no action is required. Night is often one of those times. You may still remember. That is fine. The goal is not blankness. The goal is to stop turning memory into a live event. If the image appears, let it appear. But do not zoom in. Do not replay the dialogue. Do not search the face. Do not ask what they were thinking. Do not rebuild the entire scene. That is how you stop feeding the alarm. See the thought, name it, release it, then return. Again and again if necessary. That repetition is the practice. And slowly, the body begins receiving a different message. The event is over. The room is safe. The mind is here. There is no need to prepare. That is when the nervous system can begin to believe what the calendar already knows. The danger is not current. This is also why self-command must be gentle. If you say, "Stop thinking about it," with frustration, the body hears more tension. If you say, "This is only a memory and I can return," the body hears steadiness. The Stoic ideal is not harsh control. It is calm authority. You are not attacking the mind. You are guiding it, like turning a horse away from a road it knows too well. Not with panic, with direction. This way, back to the present, back to the breath, back to what is real. And there is something deeply freeing about realizing that your body is not betraying you when it reacts. It is trying to protect you. It has simply been given old information. So update the information, not with fantasy, with fact. I am here. The event is over. They are not in this room. I do not need to respond. My body can stand down. Those sentences are not magic. They are reminders. And reminders matter because the mind can forget the present when the past becomes vivid. Tonight, your task is not to erase what happened. It is to stop presenting the event to yourself as if it still requires survival. That is the Stoic discipline of attention. You decide what deserves another minute, what deserves another image, what deserves another emotional response. And eventually, the old scene may still appear, but the body no longer follows it with the same force. The image becomes quieter, the alarm becomes weaker, the distance becomes clearer. You remember without reliving. You know without reacting. You see without entering. And that is when rest becomes possible, because the nervous system was never asking you to solve the past. It was asking you to prove, through your attention, that the danger is over. And once the body begins to understand that the danger is no longer happening, another burden becomes visible. Sometimes you are not only carrying the memory, you are carrying the belief that you must stay angry in order to prove that what happened mattered. That belief can be exhausting. You think, if I stop hating them, then I am excusing them. If I let go of the anger, then maybe what they did was not that serious. If I forgive, then they win. But forgiveness does not have to mean any of those things. It does not have to mean reconciliation. It does not have to mean restored trust. It does not have to mean inviting someone back into your life. It does not have to mean saying, what you did was acceptable. There is another form of forgiveness, a quieter one. It is simply deciding that you are no longer obligated to keep producing anger every time you remember what happened. That is different. Very different. You can still say, they were wrong. You can still say, I will not trust them again. You can still say, that relationship is over. And at the same time, you can say, I no longer want to carry hatred as proof. This is where Stoic freedom becomes powerful, because hatred is still a relationship. It is not love, but it is attachment. It keeps the person emotionally active inside you. You still react to their name. You still feel the old heat. You still imagine arguments. You still measure whether they have suffered enough. You still spend energy maintaining a position against them. That is a connection. And sometimes the final stage of release is not loving them again. It is becoming emotionally neutral enough that they no longer require a reaction. That is not weakness. That is distance. Stoicism does not ask you to become morally confused. It asks you to become internally free. You can see wrongdoing clearly without turning your entire inner life into a punishment chamber. That distinction matters, because people often confuse anger with moral seriousness. They think the more angry they remain, the more clearly they are condemning the wrong. But anger is not the only way to know something was wrong. You can remember clearly. You can set boundaries. You can refuse access. You can protect yourself. You can warn others when appropriate. You can choose never to return. None of those require permanent hatred. The wrongdoing does not become smaller because your anger becomes quieter. That is one of the most liberating truths here. Your pain does not need to stay fresh in order for the past to remain true. You do not have to bleed forever to prove you were wounded, and you do not have to hate forever to prove the person was wrong. This is where forgiveness becomes less about them and more about your own emotional economy. Ask yourself, how much energy does this hatred cost me? Not morally, practically. How much sleep? How much attention? How much mental space? How many conversations in your own head? How much tension in your body? How many hours spent hoping they feel bad? That is the cost. And what are you receiving in return? Usually very little. Hatred promises strength, but often it becomes a form of dependence. Your emotional state is still tied to the person. If they suffer, you feel satisfied. If they succeed, you feel disturbed. If they look happy, you feel injustice. If they apologize, you feel confused. If they do not apologize, you feel angry. They are still moving your inner world. That is not freedom. The Stoic question is different. What happens inside me if I stop letting their life control my emotional weather? That is where release begins. Not with affection, with independence. You do not need to wish them well. You do not need to wish them harm. You can stop wishing anything. That may be the most peaceful position of all, because sometimes forgiveness is not, I love you. Sometimes it is, I no longer need anything from you. No apology, no suffering, no explanation, no regret, no punishment, no return, nothing. That is a very powerful kind of silence. And it does not erase accountability. This is important. You can forgive internally and still maintain external consequences. You can release hatred and still refuse contact. You can stop being angry and still remember why the boundary exists. You can stop wishing suffering on someone and still know they are not safe for you. That is maturity. Because forgiveness without discernment can become self-betrayal. But discernment without release can become bitterness. Stoicism helps you hold both: clear judgment, calm heart, strong boundary, no unnecessary poison. That balance is rare. You may also notice that some anger has become part of your identity. You have been angry for so long that releasing it feels strange. Who are you without the story? Who are you if you stop talking about what they did? Who are you if their name no longer changes your mood? That can feel almost like losing something, because anger creates structure. It tells you who the enemy is. It tells you what side you are on. It gives you a story. But eventually, the story can become too small for the life you are trying to build. You are allowed to outgrow it. You can still know what happened without introducing yourself through the wound. That is another form of forgiveness. You stop making the harm your main emotional reference point. You stop waking up inside the same old conflict. You stop carrying the person into every new day. This is not forgetting. It is reducing their importance. That may be what true release looks like, not saying, "It never mattered," but saying, "It does not get to matter this much anymore." There is wisdom in that. The Stoics often returned to the idea that another person's wrongdoing belongs to their character. Your response belongs to yours. That means their cruelty does not require your cruelty. Their bitterness does not require your bitterness. Their lack of remorse does not require your endless anger. You are not morally obligated to become emotionally similar to the person who hurt you. That is worth remembering. Sometimes hatred feels like justice, but if hatred begins changing your character, then the injury is still spreading. You were hurt once by the event. Now the event is teaching you how to live. That is too much influence. You can stop it. You can say, "I will remember what happened, but I refuse to rehearse hatred as a daily ritual." That is a Stoic decision. And there is another important point. Forgiveness is not always a feeling. Sometimes the feeling comes much later. Sometimes it never becomes warm. That is fine. Forgiveness can begin as a refusal to keep feeding revenge, a refusal to keep imagining punishment, a refusal to keep checking whether life has punished them enough, a refusal to keep your peace connected to their fate. That is enough. You do not need to manufacture kindness you do not feel. You only need to stop manufacturing hostility you no longer want to carry. This is gentler and more honest. Tonight, if anger rises, do not shame it. Notice it. Ask what it is protecting. Maybe it is protecting your dignity. Maybe it is protecting the truth. Maybe it is protecting the version of you who felt powerless. Then reassure that part of yourself. The boundary still exists. I still know what happened. I am not going back. I do not need hatred to stay safe. That last sentence matters. I do not need hatred to stay safe, because many people hold on to anger like a guard dog. They are afraid that if the anger leaves, they will become vulnerable again. But wisdom can guard you better. Memory can guard you. Boundaries can guard you. Discernment can guard you. You do not need rage standing at the door forever. Let it rest. You are allowed. And perhaps this is the rarest form of forgiveness. Not loving the person again. Not restoring the relationship. Not pretending the damage disappeared. simply releasing yourself from the duty to hate. Because hatred is a duty no one actually assigned you. You picked it up because pain made it feel necessary, but what was necessary then may not be necessary now. The event is over. The lesson remains. The boundary remains. Your values remain. That is enough. You can let the hostility go without letting the person back in. And when that becomes clear, forgiveness stops feeling like surrender. It starts feeling like what it was always meant to be. Freedom from carrying someone who no longer deserves space inside you. And once you release the need to keep hating, another habit becomes easier to notice. Sometimes the wound is beginning to close, but you keep touching it to see if it still hurts. You check the name, you reread the message, you revisit the place, you search the memory. You picture what would happen if you saw them again. You ask yourself, am I over it yet? And without realizing it, you reopen what was becoming quiet. This is one of the strangest habits of healing. You want proof that you have moved on, so you test yourself. You look at their profile to see if your chest still tightens. You read an old conversation to see if you still feel angry. You play the song that reminds you of them. You revisit the place where everything changed. You imagine them with someone else. You imagine running into them unexpectedly. And then you watch your own reaction. Do I still care? Does this still hurt? Have I healed? It feels like measurement. But sometimes it is disturbance. A wound does not need to be pressed every day to prove that it is healing. In fact, constant checking can delay the quiet you are looking for. This is where Stoic discipline becomes very practical. The Stoics understood that attention strengthens whatever it repeatedly returns to. If you keep directing attention toward the injury, the mind continues treating the injury as important. Not because the event is still happening, because you keep placing it at the center of awareness. That is why healing sometimes feels slower than it actually is. You may be making progress. The memory may be fading. The emotional charge may be weakening. But then you deliberately reopen the file. And for the next hour, everything feels fresh again. Then you say, "See, I am not over it." But perhaps that is not true. Perhaps you were healing until you demanded a test. There is a big difference between a memory appearing naturally and deliberately summoning it. One is part of the mind processing experience. The other can become a ritual of checking. And rituals of checking often come from fear. You want certainty. You want to know the wound is completely gone. You want proof that this person no longer has power. So you test. But emotional healing is not a light switch. It does not move from hurt to nothing in one clean moment. Some days are quiet. Some days a memory appears. Some days you feel nothing. Another day, a small detail surprises you and brings emotion back. That does not mean you have returned to the beginning. It means healing is not perfectly straight. The Stoic response is not to panic over every emotional return. It is to judge the return accurately. A feeling appeared, that is all. You do not need to turn it into a conclusion. You do not need to say, "I thought I was stronger than this." You do not need to say, "I will never get over it." You do not need to perform another examination. Let the feeling pass through without making it evidence. That is important. Because sometimes the obsession with being healed becomes another form of attachment to the wound. You keep monitoring yourself. How much do I care now? How much anger is left? What would I feel if they called? What would I do if they apologized? What if I saw them happy? You are still organizing attention around them, even though the goal is to be free of them. This is why freedom often begins when you stop checking, you stop measuring, you stop asking for daily proof. You allow distance to do its work. Think about physical healing. If you cut your skin, you do not remove the forming scab every morning to see whether the skin underneath has repaired itself. You protect it. You leave it alone. You give the body time. The mind deserves some of the same patience. Not every wound needs constant observation. Some things heal better when they are no longer given an audience. That is difficult for the part of you that wants control, because checking feels active. Doing nothing feels uncertain. But Stoicism often teaches that discipline is not always about doing more. Sometimes discipline is refusing unnecessary action. You do not open the old message. You do not search their name. You do not ask a mutual friend how they are doing. You do not invent a hypothetical meeting before bed. You simply allow the day to remain free of them. That is an action too, a quiet one. And every time you do this, you create evidence of a different kind. Not evidence that you feel absolutely nothing, evidence that you can live without consulting the wound. That is more valuable. Maybe you still feel something. Fine, but you did not need to investigate it. You continued with your life. That is progress. There is also a hidden challenge in revisiting old messages. Words can freeze a person in time. You read something they wrote months or years ago, and suddenly you are emotionally standing in that exact period again. The message has not changed, but you have. And every time you reread it, you invite an older version of yourself back into the room. Sometimes there is no new information there, only old emotion, the same sentence, the same apology, the same lie, the same promise. If you already know what it taught you, why keep returning? At some point, the message stops being evidence and becomes a doorway. You do not have to walk through it. The same is true with places. Maybe a street reminds you of them. A restaurant, a house, a certain part of town. At first, the memory may rise strongly. That is natural. But be careful not to turn every place into an emotional test. You do not need to ask, "Can I go there?" without thinking about them. That question gives them ownership of the place. Instead, go when you actually have a reason to go. Live there, eat there, walk there, create new experiences. Not to prove anything, just because your life is allowed to continue occupying space. That is very different from deliberately returning just to see whether you can handle it. One comes from living, the other comes from testing, and testing keeps the wound at the center. There is another subtle form of checking, hypothetical situations. What if they texted me tonight? What if they asked for another chance? What if I saw them with someone else? What if they suddenly apologized? What if they were suffering? You create imaginary events to measure your reaction. But every hypothetical becomes another small rehearsal. The person returns. The emotion returns. The old story returns. And your mind spends energy preparing for something that may never occur. Stoicism asks a simpler question. Is this happening now? If not, why live it now? If one day the situation becomes real, you can respond then. You do not need to experience it 10 times in imagination first. That is how you protect peace. Not by being unprepared, by refusing unnecessary preparation for imaginary events. There is also something compassionate about stopping the checks. You stop demanding that healing perform for you. You stop forcing yourself to prove that you are okay. You allow yourself to become okay gradually. That takes pressure off the mind, because sometimes people think healing must look dramatic. One day you hear the name and feel nothing. One day you delete every message. One day you wake up transformed. But often healing is much quieter. You realize you went 3 hours without thinking about them, then a whole afternoon, then a day. Then one morning you notice the memory does not carry the same weight. Those small changes happen naturally when they are not constantly interrupted by examination. Let quietness accumulate. That is important. You do not have to announce every improvement. You do not have to test every improvement. Let it grow without inspection. The Stoic mind respects process. It does not demand emotional perfection. It asks only for wise response in the present. So if the name appears naturally tonight, notice it. If a memory rises, allow it. But do not deliberately deepen it. Do not go searching for the next detail. Do not ask how much it hurts. Do not measure the emotional temperature. Simply say, there it is. Then let it pass. That is enough. You do not need to turn every feeling into a progress report. And this is where a beautiful shift can happen. Eventually, you stop asking, am I over them? You begin asking nothing at all. You are too busy living. That is often the real sign. Not the absence of every feeling, the absence of constant measurement. You no longer need proof. You no longer need to check the scar. You know what happened. You know what you learned. And you are no longer required to keep verifying that the wound is closed. Let it close. Let the memory fade at its own pace. Let distance become ordinary. Let silence become normal. Some healing happens because you worked on it, and some healing happens because, finally, you stopped touching it. And once you stop checking whether the wound still hurts, another pressure can begin to fall away. The pressure to turn what happened into something beautiful. Not every painful event needs to become a blessing. Not every betrayal needs to become a gift. Not every loss needs to reveal some grand purpose. Sometimes something was simply painful, and that is enough. There is a strange burden people carry after being hurt. They feel they must eventually say, it made me stronger, or everything happened for a reason, or I am grateful it happened because it taught me so much. Maybe one day that will feel true, maybe it will not. Stoicism does not require you to decorate suffering before you are allowed to release it. That is important, because forcing meaning onto pain can become another way of staying attached to it. You keep looking back. You keep asking, what was the lesson? What was the hidden blessing? What did this make possible? What was the universe trying to teach me? And sometimes those questions help, but sometimes they keep the event at the center. The pain becomes a project, something you must interpret correctly before you can move on. Stoicism offers a quieter path. It says you do not need to prove that the event was good. You only need to decide how you will live now. That is enough. There is freedom in that. Because some things do not become beautiful in hindsight. Some betrayals remain ugly. Some losses remain unfair. Some humiliations remain unnecessary. Some endings remain disappointing. You can still become peaceful. This distinction matters deeply. Peace does not require approval of the past. It requires a different relationship with it. You can say, I would never choose that experience again, and still say, I no longer need to carry it every day. You can say, there was nothing beautiful about what happened, and still say, my life can become beautiful again. Those two truths can live together. That is mature acceptance. The mind often believes that if suffering did not produce something valuable, then the suffering was wasted. But that is not necessarily true. Pain does not need to earn its place by giving you a grand reward. Sometimes the only meaningful thing is that you survived it and continued. That may sound simple, but simple does not mean small. Continuing is powerful. Sleeping again is powerful. Trusting yourself again is powerful. Feeling calm in a place that once made you anxious is powerful. Laughing without remembering them is powerful. None of these require you to call the original pain a gift. The Stoics were practical about adversity. They did not ask, "How can I make this event beautiful?" They asked, "What is the wise response available to me now?" That is a much cleaner question, because the event belongs to the past. Your response belongs to the present. Maybe the wise response is patience. Maybe it is distance. Maybe it is restraint. Maybe it is courage. Maybe it is simply rest. Not every wound needs to become a philosophy. Sometimes it only needs to stop controlling your attention. That is where peace begins. There is another reason people search for grand meaning. Meaning gives a sense of control. If you can explain why the pain happened, then perhaps the world feels less random. You think, "This happened so I could become stronger. This happened so I could meet better people. This happened so I could finally understand myself." And perhaps those things eventually became true. But be careful. Something good happening after pain does not mean the pain was necessary. You are allowed to value your growth without thanking the injury. You are allowed to love who you became without pretending you needed to be hurt to become that person. That is a subtle but important difference. Otherwise, you may begin romanticizing what damaged you. You may soften what should remain clear. You may say, "It was all worth it." But perhaps it was not. Perhaps the better truth is, "I made something worthwhile after it." That gives the credit back to you, not the betrayal, not the loss, not the person who hurt you. You. You took something painful and refused to let it decide the rest of your life. That is different from saying the pain itself was good. The Stoic mindset does not glorify suffering. It focuses on response. That is why it can hold two truths without confusion. This was bad, and I can still live well. Feel how much freedom exists between those two sentences. You do not have to argue the first one away to reach the second. You do not have to say the betrayal was secretly wonderful. You do not have to say losing those years was necessary. You do not have to say the humiliation gave you exactly what you needed. Maybe it did not. Maybe it simply hurt. And still, here you are. That is enough. There is also a danger in believing every painful event must contain a grand lesson. You may keep analyzing long after the useful learning is over. You think, there must be something more here. Another insight, another hidden message, another deeper reason. So the event remains active. You keep turning it over. You keep examining it from new angles, but not every stone contains treasure. Sometimes a stone is just a stone. You can put it down. That may be the lesson. Not everything needs to be transformed into meaning. Some things need to be released from attention. This is deeply Stoic. Attention is limited. Your life is limited. Your energy is limited. So ask yourself, does this event still deserve this much of me? Not, was it important? It may have been very important. Ask, does it still deserve this much attention now? That question changes the balance. An event can be significant without being central forever. It can matter without owning you. It can shape you without defining you. It can remain part of your story without becoming the story you tell every night. That is the freedom. You stop asking the wound to become beautiful. You stop asking the person who hurt you to become your greatest teacher. You stop asking suffering to justify itself. You simply let it become past. That can feel almost too ordinary, but ordinary peace is often better than dramatic meaning. A quiet morning, a calm mind. A day where the memory does not lead. A conversation where you are fully present. A night where you sleep without revisiting the scene. These things may not sound profound, but they are the life the wound once interrupted. Getting them back is enough. You do not need a heroic ending. You need your life. There is something else worth noticing. The demand to find beauty in pain can make people feel guilty when they are still angry or disappointed. They think, "Why can I not see the blessing yet?" Maybe because you do not need to. You are not failing. You are simply being honest. Stoicism values honesty more than forced optimism. If something was painful, call it painful. If it was unfair, call it unfair. If you wish it never happened, admit that. Then ask, what is mine to do now? That is where strength begins. Not in rewriting the past, in refusing to surrender the present. You may eventually discover that the event led you somewhere valuable. That is fine. But let that realization come naturally. Do not force it. Do not turn healing into a requirement to become grateful for harm. You can be grateful for your courage, grateful for the people who supported you, grateful for the clarity you gained, grateful for the peace you are slowly building. Those things are different. They honor what came after without praising what caused the wound. That balance matters. Tonight, if the mind starts asking, "What was all of this for?" you do not need to answer. You can say, "I do not know." And then, "I do not need to know in order to rest." That sentence can bring enormous peace, because the mind is always searching for completion. But sometimes completion is not explanation. Sometimes it is permission. Permission to stop studying. Permission to stop searching. Permission to stop turning the event into a symbol. Permission to let something painful remain simply painful, and then let it become quiet. This is not giving the event less seriousness. It is giving it less territory. There is a difference. You can honor what you went through without building a permanent home around it. You can remember without worshipping the lesson. You can grow without calling the wound beautiful. That is enough, and maybe one day when you look back, you will not say, "I am glad that happened." Maybe you will say something simpler. "That happened, and I kept living." There is great dignity in that sentence, because the event did not have to become beautiful. Your life did. And after everything you have carried through this night, after every memory, every question, every unfinished conversation, there is one final Stoic act that can bring the mind back to itself. Return each person to what belongs to them. Their choices belong to them. Their motives belong to them. Their conscience belongs to them. Their regret belongs to them. Their version of the story belongs to them. And the past belongs to what has already happened. You do not need to carry any of those things into sleep. This is where the Stoic distinction between what is yours and what is not becomes more than philosophy. It becomes a nighttime practice. Because so much exhaustion comes from mentally carrying responsibilities that were never yours. You wonder whether they understand. That belongs to them. You wonder whether they feel guilty. That belongs to them. You wonder whether they tell other people the truth about what happened. That belongs to them. You wonder whether they regret losing you. That belongs to them. You wonder whether life will eventually teach them a lesson. That belongs to life. And every time you try to control these things inside your head, the mind takes on a job it cannot complete. No wonder it becomes tired. No wonder sleep becomes difficult. You have been trying to manage other people from a place where you have no authority. Tonight, you can resign from that position. You do not need to supervise their conscience. You do not need to correct their memory. You do not need to control how they explain what happened. You do not need to make sure they receive the consequences you believe they deserve. That is not your work. Your work is much closer. Your attention, your judgment, your character, your response, those remain yours. This is the quiet center of Stoicism. Not controlling the world, knowing where your control ends. That boundary can be incredibly peaceful, because when you stop trying to reach into another person's mind, your own mind becomes less crowded. Think about how many nights you may have spent asking questions that only someone else could answer. Do they miss me? Do they know they hurt me? Were they ever honest? Do they feel ashamed? Will they come back? Will they ever understand? There may be no reliable answer tonight. And that is okay. Not every question deserves another hour of your life. Some questions must be returned to the person who owns the answer. You can say, that belongs to them. Then put it down. This is not indifference, it is correct placement. Stoicism teaches you to place each burden where it belongs. If you made a mistake, that belongs to you. Learn from it. If you need to apologize, that belongs to you. Do it. If you need to create a boundary, that belongs to you. Create it. If you need to leave something behind, that belongs to you. Choose it. But if another person refuses to admit what they did, that does not belong to you. If they misunderstand you, that does not belong to you. If they create a story where they are innocent, you may not be able to change it. That belongs to them. This distinction does not remove all pain, but it removes unnecessary labor. And perhaps that is exactly what your mind needs before sleep. Less labor, less fixing, less monitoring, less carrying. You have done enough for one day. There is also the past itself. The mind often treats the past as if it is still waiting for management, as if one more thought could improve it, one more analysis could organize it, one more memory could finally make it understandable. But the past is not waiting for you, it is finished. That may sound harsh, but it can also be deeply comforting. Nothing in yesterday requires your supervision tonight. You can stop watching it. The event happened. The words were spoken, the choices were made. The ending came, whether you liked the ending or not. You do not need to stand guard over it. Let the past belong to the past, and then ask yourself, what belongs to me now? Your attention belongs to you. Where will you place it? On an old scene? Or on the quiet around you? Your judgment belongs to you. What will you decide? That you are permanently damaged, or that you have survived something painful and are still capable of living well? Your character belongs to you. What will you carry forward? Bitterness or discernment, revenge or dignity, fear or steadiness? This is where the night becomes important, because every night is a small doorway. You decide what crosses into tomorrow. Not every memory deserves to come with you. Not every argument deserves another morning. Not every person deserves another place at the breakfast table inside your mind. Some things can remain here, tonight, and then end. This does not mean the memory will never return. It may, but you can stop deliberately packing it for tomorrow. That is different. Before sleep, you can create a simple inner inventory. What am I carrying that belongs to someone else? Their judgment of you? Return it. Their lack of remorse? Return it. Their refusal to understand? Return it. Their choices? Return them. Their future? Return it. Their punishment? Return that too. You were never meant to carry another person's entire moral life. That weight is too heavy because it was never designed for your hands. Then look at what remains. Your own choices. Those are lighter because they are actionable. You can choose rest. You can choose silence. You can choose not to revisit the message. You can choose not to rehearse the speech. You can choose not to check whether they regret it. You can choose to let your attention return to the room. These choices are small, but Stoicism is built through small choices repeated with intention. And now perhaps you can practice one of the simplest. Do not follow the next thought. Let it come. Let it pass. You do not need to answer every memory. You do not need to investigate every emotion. You do not need to solve every unfinished feeling before morning. Some things become clearer after rest. Some things become smaller after distance. Some things disappear when you stop feeding them. Trust that. There is wisdom in allowing the mind to become quiet without forcing it to become empty. You are not trying to erase yourself. You are simply returning responsibility to its proper owner. That person's behavior belongs to them. Your peace belongs to you. And those two things do not need to remain connected. If they choose badly tomorrow, your character can still remain steady. If they never apologize, your life can still move forward. If they misunderstand you forever, you can still understand yourself. If they never regret losing you, you can still value what you bring to the lives that remain. That is independence. Not controlling the outcome, not needing the outcome in order to remain whole. And there is something deeply calming about accepting that some people may never become who you hoped they would become. That does not have to remain your tragedy. It can simply become information. They are who they are. And then I will choose who I am. That is enough. You do not need to carry both sides. Tonight, let every person return to their own mind. Let them carry their own choices. Let them carry their own conscience. Let them carry whatever regret they have or do not have. Let them carry their own interpretation. You do not need to enter those rooms anymore. Stay in your own. Here, you still have work worth doing. Not difficult work. Quiet work. Choose the thought you believe. Choose the meaning you keep. Choose the character you protect. Choose what deserves your attention, and then choose rest. The Stoics understood that control is not measured by how much of life you can dominate. It is measured by how clearly you know what is actually yours. Tonight, very little needs to be yours. Not their future, not their punishment, not their remorse, not their opinion, not yesterday, only this moment, this breath, this judgment, this choice. That is enough territory. Stay there. And if the mind tries once more to return to them, answer gently, their life is theirs. Then, my attention is mine. That sentence can become the final boundary of the night, because by morning they may still be the same person, they may still believe the same things, they may still never apologize. The past may remain exactly as it was, but something inside you can be different. You can wake without carrying all of it. You can wake without needing another explanation, without needing another verdict, without needing another replay. And perhaps that is the real meaning of letting go, not making the past disappear, but finally understanding what was never yours to carry into tomorrow. By morning, nothing about the past has to change for something inside you to become lighter. They may never explain themselves. They may never apologize. They may never feel the regret you once hoped for. The memory may still exist, but it no longer has to control your attention, your sleep, your identity, or the life waiting for you beyond it. Tonight, you learn to stop treating memory like a courtroom, to stop searching endlessly for motives, rewriting who you were, rehearsing conversations that will never happen, and waiting for another person's conscience to give you permission to heal. You learned that the lesson can remain without the wound staying open, that discernment does not require suspicion, that forgiveness does not require reconciliation, and that peace does not require the past to become beautiful. The Stoic path is quieter than revenge. It is choosing your character over their behavior, your attention over the replay, your present over an irreversible past. So, before you sleep, return what was never yours to carry, their choices to them, their remorse to them, their opinion of you to them, and keep only what belongs to you, your judgment, your dignity, your next decision, your peace. If you are ready to stop carrying one memory into another night, leave the words, "I return it," in the comments. Let those 3 words be your quiet decision that what belongs to the past stays there. And if you want more Stoic wisdom to help you sleep with a quieter mind and wake with a stronger one, subscribe to the channel. Now let the day end. You have thought about it enough. Tonight you are allowed to rest.